Chapter 2289. After Zhang Yan deduced the Taoist technique revealed by the spirit of creation's true body, he could see through all the details of the purple-robed Taoist at a glance. With the circulation of his Weili Qi, he could easily make use of it. This was a more brilliant method than simply suppressing it. If he were to relax a little, then the purple-robed Taoist would immediately return to his original appearance. However, the purple-robed Taoist would no longer have this chance. When this matter was done, he would naturally banish him into eternal silence, and it would be impossible for him to cause any more trouble. The purple-robed Taoist said, "I wonder what do you need me to do to help me escape?" Zhang Yan said, "Summon Pauline and let me take a look." The purple-robed Taoist immediately did as he was told. With a wave of his hand, a Pauline appeared on his palm. Zhang Yan cast a glance at it, but he shook his head. As expected, this Pauline was the one that the purple-robed Taoist had previously held, and he had already obtained the qi in it. Things were not so easy. It was obvious that the spirit of creation was also guarding against its incarnation being used by others. Therefore, it seemed that the missing one could not be found using the purple-robed Taoist's incarnation. However, this Pauline would also become an ownerless item after the purple-robed Taoist was banished into eternal silence. With his cultivation base, if it was someone else, they might give up this item for the sake of pure Tao. However, he was different. With the Tao of strength as his backing, it would not be a problem for him to keep all of the Pauline. Therefore, with a thought, he kept it. The purple-robed Taoist did not have any objection to this at all. He said respectfully, "I wonder if there is anything else that you want me to do?" Zhang Yan said, "You just need to keep the spirit of creation Weili inside into your body later." Without hesitation, the purple-robed Taoist bowed and said, "As you wish." At this moment, his mind had been manipulated by Zhang Yan. In his heart, as long as he swallowed all of these Weili, he would be able to get rid of the shackles of the spirit of creation. This was following his own heart because no independent individual would want to be like a marionette. From the bottom of his heart, he hoped to get rid of all of this, but the final result would probably be somewhat different from what he expected. He walked to the side under the complicated gaze of the Dade Masters and sat down. Then the Weili on his body surged. A moment later, the endless Weili immediately gathered into his body. Previously, Xiangju and the others were only using his Weili, and it was already good to have 1 or 2% of it. Now that he was thinking for himself, the effects of both sides were naturally very different. The person who could originally fight against him with the Weili was now no match for him at all. All the Weili of the same origin had fallen to his side. Zhang Yan looked up at the land of desolation and fragmented nothingness. He wanted to see if the spirit of creation would respond to this. If it hid and did not come out, then he could only let him clean up all the Weili and easily destroy the arrangement. If it came out, it would definitely struggle or use other means. But no matter what, as long as it reacted, then he would be able to see more things. This matter could not be completed in a short period of time. Therefore, while waiting, he also divided a part of his attention to follow the Weili that gathered in this world to look for the faintly discernible lands of creation. At this moment, the might of his Tao art far surpassed Xiangju's group, and he'd found 3 places of fortune in succession. If he could plant a Tao inheritance in such a place and help him find his missing Tao, then he naturally wouldn't complain about having too many. However, while waiting, he could also feel that as the Weili on the purple-clothed Taoist increased, the Taoist's own will was also awakening, and he slowly gained a trace of resistance. This was already within his expectations. However, if the Taoist had the support of the spirit of creation, perhaps he could still struggle for a while. But this was desolation. If the spirit of creation Weili had no support here, then it would not be able to fight against him. He changed his mind and slightly increased his strength. The struggling expression of the purple-clothed Taoist immediately calmed down. Just like just now, he did not resist at all and continued to do his best to absorb the Weili. At that moment, Xiangju and the others could clearly feel that the spirit of creation Weili that filled the surroundings was becoming thinner and thinner. Even the heavy pressure in their hearts was slightly reduced. However, their expressions were still solemn, and they didn't completely relax because of this. Although the previous progress was smooth, it didn't mean that they would definitely succeed. They also didn't know if the original spirit of creation would have any countermeasures. Only by completely expelling this mighty force could this matter be considered to have temporarily come to an end. After a long time, the purple-clothed Taoist used all his strength and finally absorbed all the Weili. Even the Weili that the clone of the spirit of creation had deliberately spread during the battle with Feng Du was absorbed into his body. But at this moment, the Taoist's expression changed, as if he was faintly trying to break free from the control. Zhang Yan looked on indifferently. After repeatedly deducing the righteous path of the spirit of creation, he noticed that there was a slight change before the latter was sealed back. Therefore, he guessed that after the remnants of the mighty force were removed, this fellow most likely had some other tricks up his sleeves. Therefore, he purposely loosened some of the restraints to see if he could draw it out. But after waiting for a long time, there was still no movement. Zhang Yan glanced at the Taoist in purple and waved his sleeve. The Taoist's expression first stiffened, and then his body gradually turned from corporeal to incorporeal. After a moment, he disappeared without a trace, and even his Weili disappeared. Obviously, he had been completely sent into eternal silence. All the old troubles had been swept away. Everyone present felt refreshed, and the uncomfortable feeling they had in the past had also disappeared. Xiang Ju came forward and bowed. "Thank you for sweeping away the filth, fellow Taoist." Everyone bowed one after another. Zhang Yan said, "This matter is far from over. The true body of the spirit of creation will return sooner or later. Everyone, the battle between us and it will have to be settled. Everyone, please try your best to draw back your Weili so that you won't have the ability to resist when the time comes." Everyone sternly agreed. After Zhang Yan finished giving instructions, he returned to Bu Shutian. After sitting on the praying mat, he pondered for a while. Although he eliminated the Weili of the spirit of creation this time, he did not force out the spirit of creation's backup plan. The spirit of creation would either lay dormant and not make a move, or it would start from the place that he valued. Now, the breakthrough point that he could find was undoubtedly the missing great Tao behind the spirit of creation. This was also the place where the spirit of creation was most likely to obstruct him. If the spirit of creation was willing to show its ability, then he would exchange a few more blows here. After thinking for a while, he stretched out his hand and pointed. Then he set up a realm gate in those places of creation. Then he sent an order to the Yen sect to spread the Tao here. In the main altar of the Yen sect, Gao Qingtu quickly received the message. He didn't dare to delay and hurriedly gathered all the elders and said, "Today, I've called everyone here because the patriarch has once again built the realm gates to 3 large worlds for my sect." When the elders heard this, they were all extremely excited. In order to avoid conflicts with the various forces, the sect of Yen had gathered a lot of branches in various places, but it also made the current expansion smoother than before. It was just that the domains with living beings were limited after all, and the ones with the human Tao were even rarer. It could be said that no matter if it was the Void Primordial Sea or Bu Shutian, most of the worlds were barren and extinct. Therefore, such places were becoming more and more difficult to find. The purpose of the Yen sect was to spread the Tao to all the worlds in the universe. Every place where the human Tao existed must allow all living beings to have the ability to fight against demons and other races, and also have the method to lead to the great Tao. Moreover, for the ordinary middle level of the Yen sect, the wider the Tao was spread, the more they would gain in their state of mind, and the easier it would be for them to cultivate. As for the upper level, because their cultivation had already reached the end, they could only act according to the patriarch's order. However, this did not mean that they had no pursuit. Although they could cultivate to the current realm without spiritual vigor, they still needed the purple pure spiritual vigor to maintain their eternal life. Now that the spiritual vigor was declining, the purple pure spiritual vigor would decrease with every use. Moreover, the sudden appearance of the large worlds meant that it was possible to find the purple pure spiritual vigor there. Tang Yu was the calmest and said, "Patriarch, are there any powerful forces in these 3 worlds?" When the elders heard this, the emotions that were stirred up in their hearts just now calmed down. Any place with abundant spiritual vigor would definitely be occupied by a powerful force. If it wasn't a big sect, it would be a big monster or a demon. Gao Qingtu said in a deep voice. The Patriarch's order has already pointed out that in these few large worlds, the Tao of the spirit of creation is the mainstream. Ordinary sects have long been annihilated by them, so our opponents are them. An elder said, isn't that a good thing? If we were to compete with the human Tao sects for spiritual vigor, we wouldn't be able to do so. But if it's just these foreign demons and demons, then it's just the right time to get rid of them. Gao Qingtu said with a serious expression, don't let your guard down. Because the Tao of the spirit of creation is the mainstream in these few worlds, their power is definitely not small. If we want to occupy these places, we will need to mobilize more people from the branch altars. Gao Gua thought for a moment and said, Patriarch, I'm afraid that with the power of the Yen sect alone, we won't be able to open up the situation in a short time. Moreover, if we fight so hard, our disciples will definitely suffer heavy losses. If something happens to Bu Su Tian, I'm afraid it will be difficult to resist. Gao Qingtu said, what ideas do you have? Just tell me. Gao Gua said, it's not really an idea, but I'm thinking, is it possible to join forces with the mountain and sea realm or the Qinghua heavens? We can give up some of the places with rich spiritual vigor. Although we will lose some benefits, we can ensure the safety of more disciples. Gao Qingtu thought for a moment and nodded. That's a good idea. My Yen sect protects the human Tao and spreads its Tao. Even if our disciples are weak, we can't just lose them. An elder Daoran said, Patriarch, it's just that these two sects might not give me face. Tang Yu said, you don't have to worry about that. There are a few sects in the mountain and sea realm that like to fight, and they often use foreign enemies to hone their disciples. If such a matter comes to them, they won't refuse. Gao Qingtu said in a deep voice, then it's settled. However, I have a feeling that it won't be long before there will be great changes in the worlds. We need to occupy these three realms as soon as possible. Chapter 2290. When Zhang Yan saw that the sect of Yen had already complied with the order to expand, he no longer paid any attention to it. Unless the sect of Yen was attacked by the forces of the upper echelons, he would not intervene. Otherwise, it would be difficult to find the missing Tao if the Weili was contaminated. If the spirit of creation left behind a move to obstruct him because of this, then it would be a good time for him to eliminate it. With his current magical power, unless the spirit of creation descended, it would be impossible for him to be his opponent. But perhaps the spirit of creation was unwilling to waste a move on this matter, or perhaps it was not the right time, but it did not come out to disturb him. The sect of Yan's attack on the three realms was very smooth, especially after it obtained the help of the cultivators of the mountain and sea realm and the Qinghua heaven. In particular, the sect of Yen had the realm gate, which allowed them to transfer their combat power to and fro. The three realms on the other side could not resist at all, and it did not take long for the sect of Yen to completely occupy it. It was easy to attack these realms, but it was not easy to change the minds of those who originally believed in the spirit of creation. In the past, it was easy to draw on a blank piece of paper, but it was not the case now. Forcibly erasing their memories might hurt their souls, and it would be difficult to produce outstanding people in this way. Therefore, they could only rely on the various deacons and altar masters to cover their memories, and then preach scriptures day and night to guide them to the sect of Yan's Tao. At this moment, Zhang Yan's divine sense was wandering in the silence, trying to find more places of fortune before the real battle. The Lord of Muddy Heaven had said that he should follow the general trend and not interfere in the overall situation, or he would be abandoned by both sides. But how could he be frightened by these words? In fact, if he wanted to, he could destroy the situation at any time. He only needed to see the spirit of creation's Tao in his divine will, and he could naturally lead it into everything. When he fought with others, he never liked to wait passively. Just now was his usual choice. Therefore, he had been thinking whether there was no need to wait any longer, and whether he should directly reveal the spirit of creation to fight with him. If he had all his strength, he would definitely do so, but the current situation still needed to be considered. The main reason was that as more places of fortune were found and the expansion of the Yen sect, more and more Taoist techniques were made up for. As for the last Pauline flower, even though it was hidden by the spirit of creation and the chances of finding it were very slim, he would not give up just like that. In the end, he would still try to search for it. However, right at this moment, a wave of fluctuation suddenly arose somewhere in the 3 dimensions, and it seemed like something unusual had occurred. With a thought, he calculated for a moment and shook his head with a smile. When I need it, it never comes. When I don't ask for it, it just comes. It was one of the 3 realms. Due to the abundance of spiritual vigor, it was only slightly weaker than the Mirror Lake. Moreover, it had experienced the massacre of the followers of Yanjiao and creation spirit Taoism. As a result, karma was stirred and the primordial jade was about to enter the world. He pondered for a moment. If there were no accidents, his qi and strength would not have much improvement in a short period of time. In the battle against the spirit of creation, although the Vedanta were also trying to summon the Wali, it was really hard to say how much strength they would recover in the end, and how much help they would be. Therefore, he had to find another way to increase his strength. This primordial jade might be able to help a fellow Taoist, and make him or her help. He retracted his thoughts and allowed the world to spin for thousands of years. Then he probed into it again. After a moment, he raised his hand and a primordial jade fell into his hand. With that, he returned to his incarnation in the green heavenly temple in the mountain and sea realm. Then he willed it and a watery glow appeared, which then coalesced into the black turtle, floating above the temple. He smiled and said, "Fellow Taoist, you were born from the laws of heaven and earth, and your spirit shines upon the world. However, you are bound by the world and can no longer improve. Today, I will help you to break through the cage and reveal your Tao above all." As he spoke, he handed over the primordial jade, and the snake head behind the black tortoise bit it. Under his Wali comfort, it only took a moment for the black tortoise to enter the true yang realm. It was extremely difficult for a Taoist cultivator to enter the gate of cultivation, but the black tortoise was guided by his spirit, so it was connected to his qi. The black tortoise would be able to advance to whatever level he could advance to. Previously, it was only because of the primordial jade that it had been blocked outside the door. Now that it had obtained this item, it would naturally succeed in an instant. However, under normal circumstances, even if there was a fortuitous encounter, it would still end there. It was limited by its foundation, and there were certain gates that were difficult to pass. However, this time, Zhang Yan happened to be helping it pass this gate, or else he would not have passed the primordial jade into its body. The black tortoise was one of the 4 gods in the heavens, and with the unity of these 4 gods, the stars in the heavens had their positions. Its essence was one side of the laws of the heavens, and it could also be said that it was the precipitation of the great Tao in every world. As long as there was a boundary, it would exist. However, without anyone to unite and refine it, it would not reveal itself on its own. At that time, it was also because the divine beast egg happened to communicate with that spiritual qi that it was able to break out of its shell. And this kind of egg, Zhang Yan had only seen it in the 9 continents throughout the heavens, and there was not a trace of it anywhere else. It could be seen that it was because of the uniqueness of the 9 continents that this thing was able to be born. It was actually not difficult for him to let it cross the barrier of the current world and transcend above all, because the black tortoise was not a cultivator, and it did not rely on its own cultivation. However, even if it entered the spirit refinement realm, it would be of limited help to him unless he could reach the level of great virtue. This was not easy to achieve. In the past, he could not do it, but now that he had this creation Pauline in his hand, he could try to push it. And the first thing he had to do was to help it cross the spirit refinement realm. When the black tortoise took form in this world, the level of the true yang had already reached its peak. It was like a jar of water that was already full. Even if additional energy was poured into it, it would only overflow and not increase. However, if this jar was broken, it would be able to flow into the vast ocean. What he had to pay attention to was that this place still required him to use his qi and constantly guide it. He could not let it do things on its own. Otherwise, in the end, it would either be lost and unable to form again, or it would be formed according to the Tao and completely separated from him, which would be far from his original intention. After making up his mind, with a thought, A ray of light shone down from beyond the world and landed on the black tortoise, instantly breaking the restraints on it. In that instant, the world seemed to rise endlessly, and the black tortoise instantly stepped into a level that all beings in the world could not reach. However, because it did not rely on its own power to achieve this, its foundation did not change fundamentally. It was only because of Zhang Yan's Weili protection that it did not collapse. At this moment, Zhang Yan stretched out a finger, and a speck of light suddenly appeared. At this moment, all the uncertain world seemed to stop. Then, the silhouettes of the black tortoise appeared in the billions of worlds, and all the silhouettes overlapped and stacked together. The billions of worlds also had a fixed black tortoise, but they belonged to different realms and did not interfere with each other. Therefore, what he was doing now was to draw out the power of the black tortoise in the worlds and use the black tortoise as the foundation to gather its power. Just like how countless droplets of water could gather into a river, it gradually grew stronger after the power of origin gathered. However, the power of each world was different, so it needed to be harmonized here. The black tortoise could not do it by itself, but it was not difficult with him presiding over it. Not long after, the commotion finally stopped. The black tortoise's figure had become solid, which meant that it could stand in the silence. Zhang Yan nodded slightly. The Dharma body of a cultivator with a human body was a copy of the original body, and the demons turned into a human because the cultivation of the human body was the closest to the great Tao, so they had no choice but to do so. The black tortoise was the manifestation of the great Tao, so it did not need to turn into a human, so there was no such thing as transformation, so it still looked the same. However, it was not the end yet. The black tortoise was at most similar to the spirit refinement Taoist cultivator and could not help him much. Therefore, he still had to help him continue to walk upwards and push him into the level of virtuous virtue. He did not act immediately. After the black tortoise's aura stabilized, he waved his sleeve and threw out the Pauline he had obtained from the purple-clothed Taoist. He imprinted it into the black tortoise's body and said, "Fellow Taoist, you can search for the great Tao. I will naturally help you by the side. If you can return, you can pluck the great Tao fruit." At the same time, he sent the secret method of ascension into the black tortoise's mind. The black tortoise's eyes were originally half closed, but after receiving the teaching, it let out a low roar. The water vapor under it moved, and its entire body instantly turned from being to non-being, disappearing without a trace. The black tortoise came from the Khanate world and was formed by the great Tao. It had not gone through any cultivation, so if there was no surprise, it should have taken the part of the great Tao that nurtured its body. The difficult part was to return to being. Fortunately, he now had the help of Creation Pauline. As long as he did not enter too deep into the river of the great Tao, this difficulty could be avoided. Zhang Yan only waited for a moment before the being began to sway. This change immediately attracted the attention of Xiangjue and the others. They asked with their divine will, and after learning that it was Zhang Yan who did it, they immediately retracted their minds. Immediately, the Pauline appeared again, and then it emitted rays of treasure light, sucking in the waves of Weili that fell from the sky. Then, the figure of the black tortoise appeared from nothingness and returned to being. Obviously, it had achieved the result. Zhang Yan looked over and saw that there were yin and yang, black and white energies swaying around its body. It could be said that the tortoise and the snake are one body, yin and yang bind life and death. He subconsciously nodded. If the yin and yang energies worked together with his divine light of the 5 elements, his combat ability would undoubtedly increase to another level. At this moment, the black tortoise lowered its head and revealed its thick shell, making a submissive gesture. He smiled slightly and took a step forward, already stepping onto the back of the black tortoise. He praised, "From the beginning, the true Tao is only free. Xiantian is known as the divine capital. One spirit cultivates the merit of 10,000 generations and looks down on all methods to show victory. Since fellow Taoist has already obtained the Tao technique and transcended the mortal world, there is no need for you to use that old title. You were originally a god of the Khanate world, but now that you have leaped above the gods, how about I call fellow Taoist Lord Du?" Chapter 2291. The Black Tortoise, or Divine Lord Du in other words, had leaped out of the present world, so he was no longer one of the four deities of heaven and earth. He had already transcended this identity. However, because he was originally a representation of the Tao, as long as he was under the Great Tao, he would not change because he was lacking something. Therefore, even if he had leaped out, there would still be the black tortoise that represented the Great Tao's order in the present world to fix his position. However, Divine Lord Du himself was completely different from before. It could be said that he had gained something and then abandoned it. With a thought from Zhang Yan, the yin and yang qi surged behind Divine Lord Du, completely controlled by his will. The latter was originally brought into the world by him, and now that it had transcended the present world, the two could be said to have the same qi. Divine Lord Du's Tao was also compatible with his. With the two working together, it seemed like his battle prowess would be greater than before. However, he had not verified it, so he had to use his divine will to deduce it. If there was anything wrong, it could be improved. Therefore, he turned his divine will and entered the unknown. There was no need to lure out the spirit of creation's true body again. He could resist that strand of power by himself, so it was not enough to test anything. Therefore, he had to find another opponent. With a thought, several figures appeared in front of him. They were similar to Fengdu, Xiangjue, and the others, but also slightly different. Their expressions were indifferent, and they did not look human at all. This was the appearance of the spirit of creation's Tao after he deduced it with this generation's Tao. However, this generation's true body might not necessarily look like this. To a Vedanta, a complete Wali and an incomplete Wali were two different things. Even if it was just a thin line, it was still a difference of heaven and earth. Therefore, with this generation's current state, even if the spirit of creation's true body came again, it would be impossible to take it down with a simple Wali collision. Of course, the spirit of creation did not unleash its full power, but he only wanted to verify the results. It was enough to test everyone's Tao when they were almost complete. With a thought, he ordered the black tortoise to take the initiative, and the people on the other side immediately responded. Every single person of this generation would utilize their own Tao arts to guide their attacks, and their objective was only to annihilate their opponents. They wouldn't have the slightest hesitation towards themselves, and coupled with their joint forces, their ability in battle would only be stronger than a real person. After several attempts, Zhang Yan had a rough idea of what to do. Seeing that there was nothing else he needed to do, he retreated from the divine will. As he divined, he seemed to have touched upon something. He stood up and took a few steps in the hall. Suddenly, his eyes lit up and he looked up at the billions of worlds. In the past, he'd once sensed that the evolution of Tao arts was a battle between each other. It was just like the collision of the great virtue Wali, the battle between the great virtues and the spirits of creation, and the battle between the teachings of the Yen sect and the various Tao inheritances. It was precisely because of this battle that he was able to draw closer to the Grand Tao. Presently, his Tao art had improved greatly when compared to before, yet he'd seen even more things because of this, and his comprehension towards the profundities of the Grand Tao had undoubtedly deepened a level. To be more precise, the reason why the battle between Tao arts was able to allow them to have a glimpse of the Grand Tao was actually because it had pushed the luck of the Grand Tao. Such actions were slightly in line with the essence of the Grand Tao, but they were still slightly off from the true Grand Tao. The luck of the Grand Tao had no beginning or end, and it had no cause or effect. Regardless of whether one's Tao art was brilliant or not, so long as one hadn't attained the state where there was only one Tao, then one would fall within it. The difference was that those who resided at the top like the great virtues were able to stir up turbulent waves within the long river of the Grand Tao, whereas those at the bottom were similarly within it, so there was naturally no difference between them. The great virtues had a Tao, and so did the spirits of creation. The latter was an incomplete law, and no matter if it was the spirits of creation or the great virtues, all of them desired this Tao. Whoever grasped it would compete for the upper hand, and this was the chance to determine victory. So in this aspect, the Tao of the great virtues was comparatively lighter, and the Tao of the spirits of creation was comparatively heavier. The battle between the great virtues directly omitted the changes at the bottom, and this actually wasn't favored by the Grand Tao. The Grand Tao itself didn't have any preferences, but the outcome would naturally be different if one went against the Tao or went along with it. In the past, they only sought the top and neglected the variables at the bottom. The reason for this was that for the great virtues, the bottom could be manipulated at will. Even if there was, they could overturn it with their strength, so what was the need to pay attention to it? However, since the bottom was also within the Grand Tao, and the great virtues sought the complete Grand Tao, how could they throw it aside? Therefore, he believed that it wasn't feasible to lean towards either side, and that both sides needed to be equally valued. Just as he was pondering, Xiangju and the others were very surprised by the sudden appearance of a great virtue in the void. On the surface, the position of the great virtue completely depended on the fortune of Pauline. If someone achieved enough merit and obtained this item, then they could take over the position. However, in reality, it wasn't that easy. Not everyone who held onto Pauline could achieve anything. Before Xiangju and the others, there were people who borrowed this item and climbed up to the top, but other than the great virtues that existed now, the others were lost in the long river of the Grand Tao, never to come out again. Wei Ming pondered for a while and said, "This fellow cultivator must be the one who achieved spirit refinement when I sensed something strange just now. From the looks of it, this person should have been supported by fellow cultivator Xianyuan. However, it is unexpected that he could achieve great virtue." Ji Zhuang identified it and said, "This Tao friend's Tao is unique. He isn't of a different race, nor is he a human cultivator. It seems like he took one end of the Grand Tao and manifested it on the surface." Heng Wu said, "Then it must be Tao friend Xuanyuan's method, but how did he do it?" Everyone was silent. Helping someone achieve spirit enhancement was something they could do if they were willing to do their best, but helping someone achieve great virtue was not something they could do. Thus, everyone faintly guessed in their hearts that perhaps Zhang Yan had obtained this ability after he obtained their Tao arts. But this was something that couldn't be obtained by being envious. Even if they were to view the Tao arts of others, it would only be able to guarantee that they would be able to suppress their opponents in battle, but they wouldn't be able to utilize it. Just as they were talking, they suddenly felt a throbbing in their hearts, and unconsciously looked towards where the robbery power was. It wasn't difficult for them to notice that the robbery power that was obstructing the spirit of creation was getting thinner and thinner. It was obvious that the shackles that were binding him were getting lighter. Even though there was still the force of great virtue there, it was hard to say when the situation would collapse. The previous battle had allowed them to understand just how weak they were when facing that person. If they wanted to survive the next battle, then they would only have a chance if they fully recovered their strength. However, judging from their current progress, there was practically no hope for them to do so. Xiangju then said, "Everyone, is there any progress in recruiting the Whaley?" Heng Wu said, "Even though the tribulation energy has been greatly weakened, we're still able to endlessly summon our own tribulation energy back to us. However, the tribulation energy we obtain is truly too weak, and the spirit of creation is about to arrive again." He couldn't help but shake his head when he spoke up to hear. Wei Ming frowned and said, "I also feel that this is not the way to go." Heng Wu felt this way, and so did he. He could also feel the threat of the spirit of creation approaching. Last time, they had been forced into nothingness without being able to put up any resistance. If the spirit of creation had not deliberately targeted them, they would have fallen into eternal silence. He did not want to experience that again. He looked at Xiangju and said, "Tao friend, what do you think?" Xiangju said, "Since Tao friend Xianyuan can help others become my peers, if I ask him for advice on how to recruit the Whaley, I believe he can give us some advice. At the very least, we can benefit from it, right?" Everyone thought about it and felt that it made sense. Before, it was because everyone's Tao was different, so it was better to ask oneself than to ask others. But now, each of their Tao had been dispelled by Zhang Yan. In a sense, he might know their weaknesses and strengths better than they did themselves. In addition, they thought that Zhang Yan would be willing to teach them if he had the ability to fight against the spirit of creation. Xiangju saw that Hongdu was silent, so he tried to ask, "What does Tao friend Fengdu think?" Hongdu said without hesitation, "It is a good idea to ask Tao friend Xianyuan. We don't have to wait, let's go and ask him now." The purple-robed Taoist was no longer in the world they created, and the spirit of creation Weili on the surface was also swept away. The effect of this world was greatly reduced. Therefore, there was no need for them to stay. They immediately came out and went to the front of Butian. They bowed and said, "Is Tao friend Xinyuan here? We have a question that we would like to consult with you." Zhang Yan walked out from Bu Su Tian and bowed, saying, "Fellow Taoists, what business do you have here?" Xiang Ju said, "Tao friend, you asked us to go back and summon the Weili to recover our strength to fight against the spirit of creation. However, it is difficult for us to continue here. Tao friend's Tao is much better than ours, so we came here to ask for your advice." Zhang Yan nodded slightly. Whether it was passive or active, the more people who could fight against the spirit of creation, the better. He said, "Just give me a strand of your qi dynamic. I will go back and deduce it. If there are any results, I will inform you in time." Xiang Ju said, "Then I will leave it to you." No one had any objections. Even their Tao was handed over, so a strand of qi dynamic was not a problem. Therefore, they each gave a strand of qi to Zhang Yan and left. Zhang Yan retracted his consciousness back into Butian. He was still unable to complete the Weili. In fact, he had considered this problem not long ago. The Taoist that existed in his consciousness would collapse every time he tried to reform it. Therefore, it was very likely that the Taoist had given up on it. Therefore, he believed that if it was not the spirit of creation that caused the Weili to be completely restored, it was very likely that the Taoist had given up on it. As for what the reason was, he could not guess. Perhaps it was because he wanted to save a part of his strength to help suppress the spirit of creation, or perhaps he simply did not want to fall into the hands of the Taoist. However, since it was able to attract a bit of mighty power, it meant that there was still room for improvement. Even if it couldn't be completed, it wouldn't be a problem if he tried to speed up the process. Moreover, he also wanted to see if there would be any abnormal changes if he gave it a push. Chapter 2292. Zhang Yan was very interested in the changes within the robbery power. He did not know what the situation was like there. When the spirit of creation broke through the next time, would the Vedantas be unable to stop him and have no choice but to let him escape, or would they deliberately let him fall into the hands of others? The results of the two were the same, but there was obviously more to the latter. From the words of the Lord of the Prison Realm, it seemed that every step was within the calculations of the Vedantas. On the other hand, perhaps every step was within the calculations of the spirit of creation. Until the end, no one would know whose methods were better. However, he was not willing to passively fall into the trap. With his current ability, he could let the spirit of creation fall into the hands of others at any time. From this point, he was also qualified to be a chess player. However, he knew too little, so he did not rashly try. Now that the Vedantas were searching for the complete path of the Weili, he could first make a small probe. With the Tao techniques of perception and the others, he had previously deduced them to perfection. Now that he had everyone's qi dynamic, if there were no obstacles, he could easily find everyone. And he wanted to take the opportunity to touch that obstacle and see what was stopping this generation of Weili from being complete. He immediately entered the divine will. With a thought, he deduced upwards based on everyone's qi dynamic. If one were to say that the few people who fought against Divine Monarch Du just now were purely reflections of his complete Tao technique, then if one could successfully deduce this, one would be able to reproduce the appearance of his true mighty power when it was in its complete form. If they were unwilling, then they would be like the Taoist with a broken will, unable to do it. As he deduced, everyone's qi dynamic turned into an image of themselves. Then, it turned from illusion to reality and slowly became clearer. Things went smoothly up to this point. However, just as they were about to be completely complete, everyone's figure distorted and then collapsed. His eyes flashed slightly, but he did not immediately come to a conclusion. Instead, he tried a few more times, but the results were the same. There were no exceptions. Once or twice might be an accident, but the results were the same. This was enough to confirm his previous deduction. However, it was a pity that there were no changes in the robbery power this time. However, Since he had promised everyone that he would help them solve the problem of summoning the mighty power that was too slow, he would naturally not go back on his word. In his eyes, this was a simple matter. The reason why everyone found it so difficult was because the mighty power itself was resisting them. However, if everyone understood this and the method of summoning the mighty power was even more appropriate, as long as they did not touch the final line, there would be no problem. He only needed to deduce a little and he had an appropriate method. Thus, he retreated from the divine will and stepped out of Bu Su Tian. In the blink of an eye, he arrived in that world. After greeting Xiang Ju and the others, he said, "I have all the techniques you need here. You can all take a look." With that, he waved his sleeve and 7 rays of light flew toward one person each. After Wei Ming saw this technique, he first nodded, and then he frowned and said, "I see that this technique can indeed help me summon more of my own power, but it doesn't seem to be able to fully recover? Is there something wrong with this method?" Zhang Yan smiled and said, "If there's anything wrong with it, it's because I've deduced that the root of this problem lies with your own bodies. It's because you're unwilling to return in one piece, so it's difficult to complete the cultivation." "Is that so?" Everyone was shocked when they heard this, but they were also pondering about the reason behind it. Zhang Yan looked at everyone and said, "In truth, there is no need to force yourself if you cannot do this. Right now, the Whaley can recover as much as it can. I believe there must be a reason for your original bodies to do this, and you won't sit by and watch your bodies be destroyed. It is very likely that after your original bodies arrive, the Whaley will be complete just now." Everyone's hearts moved. They seemed to have thought of something, but they also felt like they were missing something and couldn't figure it out. However, at least the problem before them was solved. There were many things that could be slowly explored during their cultivation. Everyone talked to each other again, then they all bowed to Zhang Yan and said, "Thank you, fellow Taoist." Zhang Yan nodded slightly, then his figure faded and disappeared. After returning to Busha Heaven, he once again sent his consciousness into the silence to search for the land of fortune hidden in the unknown world. The number of land of fortune he could find was actually closely related to the cultivation of the great virtues Tao. Now that his Tao was much better than before, he could do this again. After searching in every possible way, it didn't take long for him to find another land of fortune. However, it couldn't compare to the 3 land of fortune he found last time. This meant that it would be very difficult to find a similar place in the future. But this time, it wasn't purely for the sake of finding such a place, and it was for the sake of confirming a thought in his heart as well. So, he didn't order the sect Yen to invade this world right away, and he split out an avatar of his own to descend into the main world that attached itself to this place of creation. Ever since he became a refined god, apart from the mountain and sea realm, his incarnation rarely manifested in the main world. This was because the main world was like a picture to him. If he wanted to, he could even circulate it for millions of years in the blink of an eye. Therefore, it was meaningless to communicate with each other. This was also the reason why the being in the imprisoned world didn't care about the living beings. After all, whether they lived or died had nothing to do with him. However, he didn't think so. Apart from a few people who had achieved Xiantian success, most of the almighty beings had obtained their achievements from the cultivation of lowly living beings. The difference was that in the beginning, the essence of fortune hadn't been broken, and living beings had Xiantian Taoist magic to follow. Later people had nothing to rely on, and could only rely on the teachings of their predecessors. Now, all the great virtues he saw were achieved before the essence of fortune was broken. He was the only one who achieved the Tao after that. However, it was also because of this that he valued the living beings of the world and the inheritance of Taoist magic more than any of his peers. In the blink of an eye, Zhang Yan's incarnation was already standing on a piece of land. He looked around. Even though he had erased the Whaley of the Spirit of Fortune, it was still there. The Taoist magic of the Spirit of Fortune was still the mainstream here. This Taoist magic could actually be considered a human Taoist magic. Only living beings could cultivate it, and it was also very useful when fighting against demons and beasts. If they just followed their own Tao, it wouldn't be a big deal, and he could also tolerate it. However, the problem was that this place proclaimed that if a cultivator wanted to walk up, they must follow the Taoist magic. If a cultivator worshipped this wholeheartedly and cultivated the fruit of Tao in this way, he couldn't be called a human anymore. He would only become a puppet of the spirit of fortune. At this moment he took a step forward and came to a neat and clean wide jade path. Here, countless pious people were pushing each other's shoulders, supporting each other as they walked forward. With a glance, he understood that this was a path to enlighten the mind. Only those who truly followed the Tao could reach the end in an instant. If they didn't follow the Tao, they could only walk on endlessly. The eyes of the people in the group were numb, and they staggered as they followed the crowd forward. Most of them didn't even know where they should go. At this moment, a young man with a dispirited expression, whose eyes hadn't completely lost their spirituality, suddenly saw Zhang Yan walking on the path. He couldn't help but shiver, and he hurriedly squeezed through the crowd to the side of the path. He came up and kowtowed a few times, saying, "Taoist, I've been walking here for half a year, I wonder when I can finish this path? They all say that I'm not sincere, but how can I be considered sincere?" Zhang Yan said indifferently, "Some of the people here have walked for hundreds of years, and some have walked for dozens of years. Until now, they still haven't left this path. Do you think they are sincere?" The young man's face instantly turned pale, and he muttered a few words. Then, he came to a realization and kowtowed a few more times, begging, Taoist must have a way to teach me, please guide me." Zhang Yan looked down at him and asked, "Why do you seek the Tao?" The young man wiped his cheeks and choked with sobs. "My hometown encountered a flood, and my entire family was trapped. I heard that if I seek the immortal and cultivate the Tao, I can save my children and parents. That's why I came here." Zhang Yan looked around. It could be said that most of the people here were like this young man. They didn't seek the Tao for the sake of seeking the Tao, but to avoid the harsh governance and hardships of the world, and to find the pure land in their hearts. This kind of situation was already very rare in the realm under the rule of the Yanjiao. What flood, what volcano, what hurricane, all these natural wali were all mediated and suppressed by the Taoists of the Yanjiao. When the heavenly stars fell, it could be broken with a finger, and the power of the earthquake could be stopped with a raise of one's hand. Apart from that, there were also the spiritual plants passed down by the Taihao lineage, which made food even more abundant, and the land was covered with mulberry and hemp. It could be said that as long as the realm under the rule of the Yanjiao was orderly, there would be no hunger. Food, clothing, and warmth were no longer the first things that mortals needed to consider. However, it was different here. The Taoists wouldn't ask you how mortals were, and they simply viewed them as Tao seeds. Anyone who walked on this path of Tao would have their bodies fixed at a certain moment, and they would be able to continue existing without any external objects. One day, their humanity would be worn away in the long path of Tao, and they would completely forget their original selves. In the end, only the obsession of turning towards the grand Tao would remain, and they could become firewood for the spirit of creation Tao technique. In reality, if the people here felt that something was wrong, they could turn back and walk out of this place. However, those who came here were all for the sake of escaping the various hardships of the world, and they even held onto the last shred of hope. Thus, they would rather live like walking corpses than leave this place. Zhang Yan shook his head. If he wanted to change the situation, he could only solve the crux of the problem from the root, and not enlighten one or two people. Thus, he didn't say anything to the young man, and with another shift of his feet, he arrived before an incomparably magnificent palace that occupied a vast area. He slowly walked inside, and soon arrived at an inner hall. There was a young cultivator sitting on a platform here, and he was frowning as he held a scroll. He seemed to have a knot in his heart that he couldn't untie. At this moment, the young cultivator also noticed something. He raised his head in surprise, and saw that Zhang Yan was standing there, but there was no greeting from outside. His expression couldn't help but turn cold, and he slowly put down the scroll. He stood up, raised his hand and bowed, saying, "Who are you, Taoist? Why have you come here?" Chapter 2293. Zhang Yan looked at this young cultivator. His name was Chen Zhaoting, and he was a spirit of creation that was born into the world. After growing up in the mortal world for over 10 years, He was found by the cultivators here who worshipped the Tao of the spirit of creation and sent to this altar to cultivate. Under half coercion and half persuasion, Chen Xiaoting had no choice but to walk this path. He was a spirit of creation after all, and he easily cultivated to the level of mortal transformation in just a few hundred years. However, at this level, as he gradually leaned towards the Tao, the part that belonged to himself would become less and less as he continued to cultivate. Although everyone in the altar said that this was the only way to find the Tao and obtain eternity, he always felt that something was wrong and was unwilling to completely give himself over there. When the cultivators here saw that he was conflicted in his heart, coupled with the fact that he had only entered the Tao for a short period of time, they didn't press him too hard. They just kept mentioning the wonders of the Tao in front of him, hoping that he would wake up on his own one day. Zhang Yan knew what this person was thinking. Now, he was unwilling to submit to the Tao, but he didn't dare to completely go against the words of those elders, so he could only delay like this. He had once thought that although the sect Yen had spread the Tao technique and caused numerous spirits of creation to acknowledge his Tao technique, but similarly, because of the restriction of this, there was no one that acknowledged him outside of the sect Yen. Therefore, he had lost his narrow-mindedness. And if all the spirits of the world, even if they weren't the followers of Yen's sect, would still acknowledge his Tao, then it would be even easier to find the missing Tao than before. The Tao of the spirit of creation went against human nature. Up until now, none of the spirits of creation that were born into the world were truly willing to abandon themselves. Even if they did so on the surface, they merely wanted to borrow it for a while, but in their hearts, they were constantly thinking of getting rid of it after they had achieved their Tao. Therefore, from this aspect, every single one of the spirits of creation that were born into the world were coincidentally resisting their own Tao at the same time. It was just that the method they used was different. In the past, if it wasn't for the teachings of Yen's sect since young, when he encountered such a person, he would either eliminate them or erase their memories. But now, there was no harm in changing the method. And the reason why he did this himself was not to entrust it to his disciple, but to verify it. He asked, "Why do you cultivate?" Chen Xiaoting did not know the background of this person in front of him, but he instinctively felt that it was better for him to answer honestly in front of this person. He said with some embarrassment, "I cultivated Tao in the beginning so that I could eat my fill, wear my clothes, and have a safe house. Later, when I came to the headquarters and cultivated Tao, I wanted to transcend the mortal world and live forever." Zhang Yan said, "From what I can see, if you want to live forever, then you must follow the Tao and destroy yourself. At that time, you won't even be able to decide for yourself, so how can you talk about transcending? Even if you are immortal, you will still be enslaved by the Tao." Chen Xiaoting was startled for a moment. Then, he cupped his hands and asked tentatively, "Since Taoist priest has said so, can you teach me?" Zhang Yan said, "The choice is your own business, but what do you think?" Chen Xiaoting thought carefully and sighed helplessly. He said, "The elders in the headquarters told me that the Tao of creation is the supreme Tao. If I become one with it, then it won't be difficult to peek into the realm of Tao. But as Taoist priest has said, I am also unwilling to abandon myself, but as for the elders in the headquarters, I am powerless to resist, so what can I do?" Zhang Yan said, "Have you ever thought that if the Tao can swallow you, then why can't you swallow the Tao in turn?" Chen Xiaoting's heart could not help but tremble. He was surprised and hesitant. Can I do this?" Zhang Yan said, "Let me ask you, are you willing to join my Tao?" Chen Xiaoting hesitated. "Taoist priest, can I change to another Tao?" Although he did not dare to continue cultivating, he was also unwilling to abandon his original Tao. Zhang Yan smiled and shook his head. "Cultivating Tao is only cultivating the body, cultivating the heart is cultivating Tao. There are many people like you in my Tao, but they have always been independent. Therefore, Tao is not about what Tao you cultivate, but what Tao you agree with in your heart." Chen Xiaoting was puzzled at first, but then he exclaimed in surprise. He suddenly remembered that the elders in the headquarters could be said to be completely devoid of humanity. If the people outside were walking corpses, then weren't these elders puppets too? Not only them, but even some ordinary disciples were the same. On the contrary, although he also cultivated the same Tao, Wasn't it because his heart was unwilling to agree with the Tao that he could always maintain his original nature? Otherwise, he would be a different person now. The more he thought about it, the more he felt that it made sense. They obviously cultivated the same Tao, but the different understanding caused the different results. Most importantly, this statement was very much in line with what he wanted. Not only could it maintain his current state, but it seemed like it could also help him get out of the current predicament. He unconsciously said sincerely, "Taoist priest, what you said is very reasonable. It's just that with my own ability, I'm afraid it's difficult for me to stabilize myself. I wonder if Taoist priest can point me in the right direction?" Zhang Yan pointed with his finger, and a jade scroll appeared in front of him. "After you read this, you will know what to do." Chen Zhaoting happily took it, and then asked carefully, "Taoist priest, why are you helping me?" Zhang Yan said indifferently, "I'm not helping you, I'm helping all living beings, and helping all living beings is also helping me." Chen Zhaoting did not really understand the meaning of this, but he could feel that the person in front of him could easily control him. So if he wanted to do something to him, there was no need to be so complicated. And if the Tao that the person gave him could really save him from the fate of being devoured by the Tao, then that would be the best. Even if it did not work, the result would not be too bad. He immediately cast his mind into the jade scroll, and after a while he was absorbed in it. There was a Tao technique of teaching Yen, but because it did not ask him to change the Tao technique, he hurriedly skimmed through it. Instead, there were many scenes under the rule of teaching Yen, which made him very surprised. He had only entered Tao for 100 years, but he had cultivated to an extremely high realm and had a lifespan of 10,000 years. Moreover, after coming to the headquarters, he had always been cultivating and had never gone out. So his temperament was actually still the same as when he was young, and he did not like dry and boring cultivation at all. He yearned for all kinds of beautiful and interesting things, and all of these seemed to be found under the rule of teaching Yen. All of these, however, formed a clear contrast with everything in the world that he was currently in. He originally thought that the world had always been like this, because it had been like this since he was born, but now it was different. A thought of changing all of these spontaneously arose in his heart, and at the same time, he unconsciously approved of the teaching Yan's actions. With this thought, he instantly felt that he was a little further away from the Tao technique of the spirit of creation, but his mana had also weakened a little because of this. He could not help but be shocked. Although he sympathized with the people of the world, he also knew that his own cultivation was what he could rely on. If he lacked this, then he would be nothing. But right at that moment, a piece of corroded text appeared on the jade slip. With a single glance, it contained the solution to the problem. He thought about it, because just now, the mana that he had lost was not much, so he tried to cultivate according to this, but he was pleasantly surprised to find that not long after, the mana that he had lost recovered, and it was completely under his control. It was not like in the past, where it seemed like someone had entrusted it to him. He couldn't help but open his eyes. He looked over and said sincerely, "Taoist priest, your Tao technique is indeed useful. However, I'm afraid that if this goes on, the elders in the headquarters will see through my tricks. I wonder if Taoist priest can help me wipe out all the elders in the headquarters?" In the headquarters, his cultivation was not the highest, and there were many elders who had already severed their past and future bodies, so he was very afraid that what he had done would be exposed. Zhang Yan said, "This matter can only be done by yourself, I will not interfere." He had already expected Chen Zhaoting's request. Every cultivator with an independent consciousness would naturally resist the Tao technique of the spirit of creation, not to mention that he had another Tao technique in his heart. In order to maintain himself, he was naturally opposed to those who worship Tao techniques, so even without him urging, he would take the initiative to be hostile to this generation. However, when pursuing the Tao technique behind the spirit of creation, he could not directly use his own Weili, and he could not even interfere with the specific matters. Otherwise, why would he go through so much trouble? Wouldn't it be easier to directly change the consciousness of the people of the world? Chen Zhaoting murmured, "Looks like I have to do this myself." He still bowed and said, "I hope that Taoist priest can give me pointers from time to time." Zhang Yan nodded and said, I will not leave this place for a while. If you have any questions, you can come and ask me at any time." Hearing his words, Chen Xiaoting's confidence instantly increased. He pondered for a while, combined the contents of the Jade Scroll, and thought of a way. After making some arrangements, he announced to the public that he was going to go into closed-door training. This time, he did not deal with things as he did in the past, but completely for himself, so he put all his attention into it. Since he had gotten rid of the obstacles in his heart, the potential of the body that belonged to the spirit of creation that was reincarnated into the world was fully revealed, and his cultivation base rose steadily in a very short period of time. Very soon, he had reached the level where he could sever his past and future bodies. When the elders in the headquarters heard about this, they were very happy, thinking that he had come to his senses, but at this moment, they were faced with another problem. They realized that even if Chen Xiaoting had cultivated to this level, without Zhou Huanyuan Jade, it was impossible for him to go further. These elders had cultivated for a long time, so they were faintly able to discern some inheritances from Dao arts, and they knew that he still needed something to assist Chen Xiaoting in attaining the Grand Dao. However, Origin Jade had never appeared in the outside world that was attached to the land of creation, so they had no way of knowing what it was. While they were distressed, Chen Xiaoting mentioned that he'd obtained inspiration from the Dao arts, and he had a premonition that there was a thing that could assist him. However, drawing this thing into the world depended on karma and slaughter. For example, cultivators like them had to slaughter demons and devils in order for it to be possible. All the elders were doubtful at the beginning, but after they jointly deduced it, even though they only had a vague feeling, they noticed that this was correct. In the past, they didn't care about the variant race, and so long as they didn't obstruct them, they couldn't be bothered to spare a glance at them. Now, after they found out about this matter, they immediately launched an extermination against these people. Chen Xiaoting's actions weren't entirely for the sake of Origin Jade, and it was also for the sake of relying on this to weaken the forces in the headquarters. After both sides suffered heavy losses, he would make a move and eliminate all these people. After that, he would imitate the method of teaching and completely transform the entire universe. On the other hand, Zhang Yan's clone watched silently from the side. If his thoughts could be verified, then perhaps the process of finding the missing Dao would be able to be sped up once more. Chapter 2294. In order to ensure that karma stirred, and with Chen Xiaoting's deliberate instigation behind the scenes, the elders in the main altar attacked all the alien races in the heavens and realms at the same time. This caused the strength of this generation to be greatly dispersed, and it was inevitable that they suffered many losses. Countless disciples died, and several elders even lost their lives. However, no one showed any signs of pity because of this. Instead, all of them treated it with indifference. They had long regarded themselves as a part of the Tao, so much so that they no longer considered themselves to be human. As long as they were moving towards the goal of returning to the Tao, they felt that any price was worth it. Chen Xiaoting had been waiting restlessly. The more the forces that worshipped the Tao suffered, the more advantageous it would be for him to act in the future. However, he was also afraid that the elders would find out that something was wrong and grow suspicious of him. Fortunately, this did not happen. During this period, he would visit Zhang Yan from time to time, not to ask for advice, but because he was afraid that the latter would leave. He had cultivated for a long time, and he had relied on his own potential to cultivate to such a high level. He had almost no experience in his life, so he was still lacking in temperament. With Zhang Yan around, he was still confident and could do things step by step. However, if the latter was not around, he would very likely panic and become at a loss. As the speed of replenishment was far lower than the rate of consumption, the elders also briefly adjusted their strategy of attacking everywhere at the beginning. They concentrated their forces on the few territories where the demon forces were strong. This way, the casualties were greatly reduced. Seeing this, Chen Xiaoting felt that things were not going well. If this continued, he was afraid that the demons and alien races would all be eliminated and the elders would not suffer any more losses. He used the reason that he had not seen the Yuan Jade for a long time and that he had not stirred enough karma to urge them to speed up the elimination of the alien races. Because he was doing this in the name of the Tao, the elders did not have any objections, and even felt that it was very reasonable. Thus, they increased the speed of the conquest, and the casualties increased again because of this. At one point, Chen Xiaoting was worried that the elders would force him to go out and fight against the demons and alien races. Fortunately, he was still the middle hall master in name, and could be considered the incarnation of the Tao. Therefore, before an opponent that could threaten the main altar appeared, there was no need for him to appear. He only needed to stand guard at the back. After a dozen years, the number of people with profound cultivation in the main altar became fewer and fewer, and Chen Xiaoting knew that it was about time for him to act. Before this, he paid another visit to Zhang Yan to strengthen his confidence. Then he used the middle hall master's name to summon an elder back and take care of him as quickly as possible. Seeing that things had gone smoothly, he tried to summon another person. The whole thing could be said to be a daunting experience, but not a dangerous one. These elders did not think that he would do such a thing, and it was very easy for him to succeed. Once these people were removed, the rest of the people who were not as strong as him were not a concern. After roughly a few years, he eliminated all the enemies that could pose a threat to him and took complete control of the headquarters. Thus, he came before Zhang Yan's clone and said respectfully, "Taoist priest, I've already eliminated all those people who advised me to worship the Tao. May I know what I should do now?" Zhang Yan said calmly, "I've already made my intentions clear. For yourself, you are also a person. The Tao lies in your heart, not in external laws. If you think it's feasible, then go ahead." Chen Xiaoting said seriously, "Elder, I understand." After he retreated, he changed all the worlds under his rule that had living beings of the human path according to his own will. Without the interference of those elders, it was even easier to deal with the disciples below him. He directly erased the original memories and changed them to what he wanted them to see. Almost overnight, all the disciples who originally believed in the spirit of creation Tao listened to him. However, he wouldn't really trust these people. He was prepared to wait for the next generation of Taoist cultivators to grow up, and then he would replace all of them. He acted according to the rules of the Yen sect that he saw in the Jade Scroll. Mortals had suffered too much in the current situation of the worlds. No matter what he did, it was better than before. Even if there was something wrong, he would try to change it. It would not be worse than before. In just a few decades, the worlds that were attached to this land of creation were almost the same as the Yen sect's rule except for the difference in the cultivation of Tao. Zhang Yan quickly sensed that the obstruction in his deduction of the Tao art that was lacking had decreased slightly. This undoubtedly showed that it was indeed as he'd thought. Even if this world wasn't occupied by the Yen sect, so long as the creation spirits here acknowledged his Tao inheritance, then he wouldn't even have to cultivate it, and it would still be able to assist him in observing the Tao art. Although this world did not have the feeling of being connected to the top and bottom like when the Yen sect was under the rule of the Yen sect, and there might be a repetition in the future, this was undoubtedly a way to achieve the Tao. This meant that even if it was not occupied by the Yen sect, it could still help him to see the Tao. The Yen sect still occupied an important position in this world because the rules in this world were completely copied from the Yen sect's original set. This also deepened the sense of recognition of the people. If there was no Yen sect first, then there would be no reference for Chen Xiaoting's actions, and there would be a layer of separation. He could not help but think that if the Yen sect and this method of imparting Tao worked together, then the effect would be much more than before. It was just that this place might require his incarnation to go. If it was a disciple, it would also be effective, but there would undoubtedly be more estrangement from the world than before. Obviously, this kind of Tao of the missing Tao required Vedanta to stoop down and personally search for it in the mortal world. With this thought, he already had a plan in his heart. If he came down and found such a place again, if the Tao of the spirit of creation was still the mainstream, then he should consider using this method. Among them, the one that could be guided the most was the incarnation of the spirits of creation. In the eyes of those who worshipped the Tao of the spirit of creation, they were the closest to the Tao. However, in his eyes, the more this kind of person was oppressed, the more they wanted to get rid of the shackles. If he could use it well, it would not be inferior to the merit of imparting Tao. Therefore, he made up his mind and allowed the incarnation to stay in the mortal world, while his original body continued to search for the land of creation. However, he did not think that this method would be carried out without any twists and turns. Not to mention other things, if the Wali, the spirits of creation, saw that he occupied more and more of the missing Tao, they would most likely come out to obstruct him. Thinking of this, he looked at the place where the calamity power gathered, and his gaze became a little deeper. Or, it was not just the spirits of creation. In the blink of an eye, another dozen years passed, and the world where Chen Zhaoting was became more and more stable. However, ever since he knew that the cultivators who cultivated the Tao of the spirit of creation were not the ones he had seen, he was also extremely uneasy. He was afraid that such people would come to him, so he pleaded with Zhang Yan to build a realm gate in his own world to communicate with the Yan sect so that they could help each other. Zhang Yan did not refuse. In reality, doing so would allow the spirits of creation to acknowledge him even more deeply. In reality, there were still many people in this world who worshipped the Tao of the spirit of creation, but it was not worth bothering about. He did not need the Wali to intervene, as it was impossible to make all the spirits of creation lean towards him. Even the spirits of creation could not do it, so it was enough for him to have such a situation. And just as he was looking for the next land of creation, he suddenly opened his eyes and saw that there was a Wali seeping out from the cracks in the void, and it was coming towards Bu Shutian. He felt a sense of familiarity from it, and his heart moved slightly, but he did not stop it. There was some strange movement in the sky, and there was obviously a consciousness that was inviting him. His eyes flashed slightly as expected, it came. But unexpectedly, before the spirits of creation could react, it was the great virtue in the calamity power that acted first. He thought for a moment and sent a strand of consciousness into the prison world sky. In a flash, he was inside the sky and saw the Taoist from last time standing there. The Taoist bowed and said, "Greetings, fellow Taoist." Zhang Yan returned the greeting and said, "Fellow Taoist, just now, you have the intention to invite me. What is it?" The Taoist said, "I came for fellow Taoist, and I hope that fellow Taoist can find the missing Tao." Zhang Yan said indifferently, "Why? I am searching for my own Tao. What does it have to do with you all?" The Taoist said in a deep voice, "What fellow Taoist is doing now is getting closer to the missing Tao. If this continues, the spirit of creation will have to use other methods to suppress fellow Taoist." Zhang Yan glanced at him and said, "I am looking for the method buried by the spirit of creation, so if he wants to make a move on me, it will be perfect. Moreover, if I force him to make a move, wouldn't that be a good thing?" The Taoist said, "Every action of the spirit of creation involves the overall situation. He is scheming against me, and I am scheming against him. Pulling one hair will affect the whole situation. Although fellow Taoist's actions can mess up his plans, it will also cause us to lose our plans. Thus, I have come to advise fellow Taoists to stay calm for now and wait for the overall situation." Zhang Yan was deep in thought. According to what the Taoist said, it was nothing more than saying that his actions had increased many variables. From this, it could be deduced that the battle was carried out according to certain rules. These rules might not be set by both sides, and it was very likely that they had no choice but to do so. However, since the conflict between both sides was actually irreconcilable, one side would definitely fall. Thus, it was still the same saying, victory and defeat could not be seen until the end. He looked at the Taoist and said indifferently, "Everyone has their own plans, and I also have my own plans. We are both people who seek the Tao, so why should I bend myself to follow others? I'm afraid it will be difficult to convince me with just fellow Taoists' words." The Taoist wanted him to follow the overall situation, but didn't clearly state what he was going to do. This was unable to convince him. In other words, he clearly had the ability to control the overall situation, but the Taoist wanted him to completely follow the overall situation and didn't want him to know the inside story. How could this be possible? Moreover, when facing a great enemy like the spirit of creation, it was impossible to win his trust with just one person's words, and there was no way to prove that this wasn't the spirit of creation's arrangement. The Taoist was silent for a while before he said, "I understand fellow Taoist's meaning, But this time, I am only communicating with my incarnation through some Weili. The spirit of creation is also watching from the side, so there are many things that are difficult to explain. Please wait for a while, fellow Taoist. It won't take long for you to understand everything. Chapter 2295. Zhang Yan listened to the Taoist's words and smiled faintly. How long would he have to wait? Now was the time to fight for the Tao with the spirit of creation, and there was no time to waste. If there was even a moment of delay, the spirit of creation's true body would enter the all-beings, so it was best to seize the initiative. Therefore, he was completely unmoved and said, "What is an opportunity? If you don't say it clearly, then I will do my own thing. When I see the opportunity that you mentioned, I will stop." The Taoist said in a deep voice, "Fellow Taoist, you need to know that you are the spirit of creation. The Weili has nothing to do with us. Therefore, I really can't say it clearly now. When the power of robbery is broken and the qi contract is formed, then we will know." When Zhang Yan heard this, he was slightly moved and said, "According to what you said, those who are in the situation can understand the overall situation. In that case, the Taoist friends in the void are also in this situation." The Taoist said, "Of course, but these Taoist friends are slightly inferior. Similarly, they can only know everything after the power of robbery is broken. I am not stopping them, it is their own choice." Zhang Yan pondered for a while. According to what the Taoist said, Xiang Ju and the others were not complete. Their purpose was to participate in this battle. Therefore, they left a part of their power in the power of robbery, causing it to mix with the spirit of creation and the Vedanta. This way, they would not be expelled from the Weili. However, the Taoist's words still did not really dispel his doubts. Because once the power of robbery is broken, it would be the time for both sides to fight. So what if he knew everything at that time? Other than going up to fight, he could not do anything else. Instead of that, it was better to find ways to increase his own strength and wait for the situation to change. He said, "Although you have said all this, it still did not touch on the foundation. I think you will not say it clearly. If that is the case, I will find a way to verify it." When the Taoist saw this, he knew that he could not persuade him, so he said in a serious tone, "What should be said has been said. The general situation cannot be disobeyed. I hope that you can think carefully. You must know that it is difficult for a single person to resist the spirit of creation. If the overall situation collapses, everything will be overturned. Tao techniques will be seized, and no one will be able to survive alone." After he finished speaking, he turned into nothingness and disappeared. The strand of Weili that leaked out from the tribulation power also disappeared. Zhang Yan sneered as he watched him leave. The Taoist was implying that he was a hindrance to the big picture, but in his opinion, it was just an alarmist talk. If what he did was a hindrance, then Xiang Ju and the others had tried to recruit Hongdu into the human realm, and then Hongdu had tried every possible way to attract the spirit of creation to incarnate. Were these not hindrances? According to what that Taoist said, if they did that, they would have ruined the situation long ago. Would they still need to wait for him to ruin it? Moreover, if this matter disturbed the Vedanta, would it not disturb the spirit of creation? Regardless of whether it was the spirits of creation or Vedanta, their ultimate goal was to pursue the great Tao. Even the spirits of creation were born for this reason. Therefore, it was not a foregone conclusion for both sides to defeat each other. The one who could complete his great Tao and reach a higher realm would be the final winner just now. Here, the missing Tao could not be avoided. No matter who won in the end, they would definitely come to find this Tao. Therefore, the biggest possibility here was that he was ahead of everyone else in searching for the missing Tao. Moreover, it was possible that he would continue to maintain this advantage, which caused some people to be unable to sit still and use this excuse to delay his actions. The reason why he said it was some people was that the Vedanta did not have the same opinion at all times, other than fighting against the spirit of creation. And under the premise that he couldn't be sure of anything, he couldn't trust anyone other than himself. Therefore, he decided to ignore it. He changed his mind and returned to Qinghuan Palace, ready to continue pursuing the missing Tao. It should be known that the more the Tao improved, the more lands of creation he could find. On the other hand, when he imparted the Tao, there would be reciprocation. At the moment, no one was competing with him. If he waited and did nothing, he might miss this opportunity and there would be no more. Although the Taoist was unwilling to reveal the inside story in the end, it was not difficult for him to feel that when the Tao improved a little more, he would naturally know what he needed to know. Perhaps it was for this reason that he could not wait to stop him just now. With this thought, he turned his gaze and observed everything, continuing to search for the lands of creation. On the other side, after Xiang Ju and the others received Zhang Yan's cultivation technique, they were able to summon the mighty force extremely quickly. Their strength was also gradually recovering, but they soon reached a point where they could no longer summon it. They discovered that it was just as Zhang Yan had said. They were unable to absorb the last strand of mighty force. However, it just so happened that this strand of mighty force was the key. Without it, not only would their memories not be complete, but their combat abilities would also be much weaker. At this moment, everyone suddenly felt something and looked at Bu Xiutian. Just now, there was clearly a strand of Wei Li leaking out from the crack and landing here. After a long silence, Wei Ming suddenly sighed and said, "Brother Xianyuan has recently found a few more places of fortune. In addition to Brother Xuanyuan's previous gains, I'm afraid that the Tao he has obtained is already far ahead of us." Heng Wu said, "It is already good enough that Taoist Xianyuan did not come to take the lands of creation I found and did not restrict my Tao. Why do you need to ask for more?" Hong Du interrupted coldly and said, "In my opinion, what is the use of keeping these lands of creation? You are no match for the spirit of creation no matter what. Why don't you give them to Taoist Xianyuan? That way, you might be able to protect yourselves." As soon as he said this, everyone could not help but think about it seriously. Ji Zhuang said in a low voice, "Perhaps this can be done." Wei Ming was a little hesitant. After all, they still occupied some of the Tao that was missing. If they gave it up, then they would have nothing left. Xiang Ju said meaningfully, "Taoist Fengdu is right. Since we cannot compete with Taoist Xianyuan on this Tao, why should we be so stubborn? Taoist Xianyuan has not said anything now, but if he changes his mind at any time, will you still be stubborn?" Everyone felt a chill in their hearts. Indeed, even though Zhang Yan was speaking kindly to them now, this was a battle for the Tao after all. If Zhang Yan did not come to them now, it might be because he could still find the lands of creation. If he could not find them, he might turn around and target them. Moreover, they had already given up their Tao, so what was the point of persisting? It was better to give up the lands of creation as soon as possible to avoid any more trouble. Heng Wu said, "The Wei Li were able to find so many because of Taoist Xianyuan. We should return this favor, so I think this method is feasible." Everyone was clearly aware in their hearts that the so-called favor was merely an excuse. No matter how hard they tried, it would be impossible for them to occupy this path. Since there wasn't much hope in doing this, it was better to offer it to Zhang Yan as soon as possible. Then, when the spirit of creation arrived, perhaps Zhang Yan would give them some face and protect them. Therefore, they did this not because they had no selfish motives, but because they knew that they could not compete with Zhang Yan and the spirit of creation, they might as well settle for the next best thing. Seeing that no one had any objections, Heng Wu said, "Since we have decided to give it up, then let's take all the Tao teachings in these lands of creation." Xiang Ju smiled and said, "There is no need for that. It's fine as long as we do not actively support them. We have already given them up. Don't tell me Taoist Xianyuan does not know how to deal with them?" When everyone heard this, their hearts moved and they nodded. If Zhang Yan decided to punish them, they would ignore it. If he didn't punish them, they would still leave their Tao inheritance there, and they would pretend that they didn't see it. After the discussion, everyone moved their divine wills and tried to communicate with Zhang Yan. Zhang Yan immediately sensed it. Seeing that Xiang Ju and the others had come, he knew that there must be something going on. He accepted everyone's divine wills and said, "What brings you here?" Xiang Ju bowed and said, "Fellow Taoist Xianyuan, everyone knows that you are trying to find a way to fight against the spirit of creation. We, the Wei Li, are unable to do anything. However, we are willing to offer all the lands of creation under our rule to you in the hope that they will be beneficial to your understanding of the Tao. Zhang Yan was slightly surprised. He did not expect that this person would take the initiative to give these lands of creation to him. He did not have any intention of occupying these lands before. Firstly, he still had the energy to search for the lands of creation. Secondly, keeping these lands of creation might be a bait to attract the spirit of creation. However, since this person was willing to do so, there was no reason for him to refuse. Moreover, this was indeed beneficial to him in his pursuit of the Tao. He took a look and found out that there were 3 places of creation under the Weiming Plain. Later on, everyone joined forces to find another place. However, they were afraid that he would discover it, so no one occupied it. After that, they found 2 more places in succession. In total, there were 6 places of creation. Suddenly, there were a few more lands of creation. If it was before, he would have to go through a lot of twists and turns to teach. However, now that there was another way, he might be able to occupy them in a short period of time. Thus, he nodded and said, "Thank you, everyone." Seeing that the matter was settled, everyone did not say anything more. After bowing, they took their leave. After Zhang Yan retreated from the divine will, he could not help but laugh. Xiang Ju and the others did not think of sending the lands of creation, but chose to do so at this time. This person must have seen the Taoist Wei Li fall to Bushutian and thought that the battle of victory was imminent. It was useless to occupy these lands of creation, so he could not wait to offer these lands of creation. However, there was one thing that this person was not wrong about. From the movement from the crack, the robbery power was on the verge of dissipating. Otherwise, the Taoist Wei Li would not have landed so easily, nor would he have been able to react so quickly to Zhu Yu's situation. If there were no accidents, the spirit of creation would fall into Zhu Yu's hands soon. Chapter 2296. Zhang Yan's gaze swept across the land of creation given by Xiang Ju and the others. He already knew the specific details. 5 out of the 6 territories were similar. Although Xiang Ju and the others had left behind their teachings, they had never planned to rule the world. They would not care about such trivial matters, so the world could be said to be filled with conflicts and chaos. Under such circumstances, people's minds were at peace. Every time the sect Yen went to a place, they would definitely kill demons and quell disasters. This was in line with the wishes of all living beings, so it was not a problem to hand these places over to the sect Yen. He immediately sent an order to the sect Yan's headquarters. He ordered Gao Qingtu to lead his followers to occupy the 5 places of creation first, then think about the rest. It was fine even if there were some loopholes. If the spirit of creation appeared because of this, then they could deal with it all at once. As for the last place of creation, it was a little different. An outstanding person appeared here, and he actually suppressed many sects to the point that they could not lift their heads. It should be known that every sect that remained in this world was passed down by Vedanta. Their strength lay in the speed at which they spread their Tao. As long as the number of followers was large, there would definitely be someone who could ascend to the upper realm. Ordinary sects might be able to gain the upper hand in a short period of time, but after a long time, they would definitely be exhausted to death. This person could actually rise in such a dangerous environment and suppress the sections. It was indeed very impressive. However, although this was strange, there was nothing unreasonable about it. After all, this was the world where the Tao showed its holiness. If there was an outstanding person who happened to stand opposite the Taoists, then such a thing could indeed be done. From Zhang Yan's point of view, as long as this person was not the reincarnation of the spirit of creation, then it did not matter. These places were originally under the rule of Xiang Ju and the others, so this problem naturally did not exist. Moreover, it was even easier to deal with this world. As long as this person acknowledged his teachings, then the following matters would come naturally. Therefore, he changed his mind and sent an avatar to this world. Putting aside his teachings, the mortals, no matter how powerful they were, could not be compared to the level of Vedanta. However, he felt that this was not the case. The spirit of creation bore the evolution of the missing Tao. In the future, when the spirit of creation fought with the great virtues, Although it might not be able to make its own decisions, it would at least be a participant. It might be able to play a certain role. He pondered for a moment. The battle between the virtuous benevolence and the creation spirit would implicate billions of realms. Other than Bushutian, even a place like Mirror Lake might not be safe. It was just that the last time the spirit of creation had come, it hadn't done anything overturning. He had a feeling that perhaps preserving the existence of everything was a tacit agreement between the two parties. However, he could not pin his hopes on this. The only thing he could do was to make everyone acknowledge his teachings as soon as possible. By then, everything would be overturned, but the Tao techniques that he had already found would not be lost. Therefore, he needed to digest these lands of creation as soon as possible. Another few decades passed in the blink of an eye. As the creation spirits of these 6 places of fortune were absorbed into his Tao, his understanding of the missing Tao became clearer and clearer. Just as he had expected, as his Tao improved, he gradually saw many things that he didn't know about in the past. It was like when he first became a spirit refinement cultivator. He saw the scene of the essence of creation shattering, but he couldn't see what happened before or after. This was because his Tao techniques only reached this point. However, once his cultivation level increased, he would be able to see more. At this moment, many scenes floated through his eyes. When he finished, he thought to himself, I see. The virtuous benevolence each held a part of the Tao, and when they united, they could truly control the operation of the Tao. The virtuous benevolence and the spirit of creation fought against each other. Although they were fighting, they were also using each other to guide the Tao in the direction they wanted. This was the general trend that the Taoists spoke of. Although Xiang Ju, Wei Ming, and the others also held the Tao in their hands, because the Weili were relatively weak, they belonged to the minority. Once the general trend changed, they would naturally be swept away and couldn't resist at all. However, with the appearance of a variable like him, it was different. As he grew stronger, Xiang Ju and the others could completely rely on him and form another force. This would cause the general trend to no longer be in one direction, but would instead be divided into 2 sides. Under such circumstances, the virtuous benevolence would either suppress him or try to rope him in. The Taoist from before tried to persuade him, hoping to make him stop. If he really listened, then he would really lose control of himself. When the final battle came, he could be used as a chess piece at any time. Although not all the virtuous benevolence were against him, this was the will of the general trend. Once this trend was formed, as long as one was in the situation, no one could resist. Zhang Yan's eyes flickered. From the looks of it, whoever had the upper hand would have the upper hand. Rather than leaning toward the other side, he might as well give it a try and see if he could take control of the overall situation. And it wasn't impossible. Just as he thought about it, he suddenly felt a force emerging. His eyes flashed. After waiting for so long, the spirit of creation's trump card was finally revealed. With a thought, an incarnation had already landed in a certain part of the world. On a river embankment, there were willows on both sides of the river. There were travelers and merchants coming and going. A young Taoist with his robes unbuttoned and slightly wild was leaning against a tree. He was drinking wine in big gulps. At this moment, his eyes glanced casually and saw a young Taoist in a black robe walking over. He couldn't help but be surprised and said in annoyance, I didn't expect to be seen by fellow Taoist while hiding here. Wait, let me drink this jar of wine first. He raised his neck and gulped down the wine. Then he threw the wine jar away and spread his arms, looking like he was ready to be hit and killed. Zhang Yan didn't attack immediately. He glanced at the person and said, In my opinion, the spirit of creation ordered you to be here for the sake of destroying this world and obstructing me from seeking the Tao. You originally had many opportunities, so why didn't you make a move? The young Taoist said indifferently, The main body left me here to stop fellow Taoist. Unfortunately, he himself is emotionless and has no attachments, so how can he appreciate the various wonderful tastes of the world? I fell into the world and enjoyed all kinds of good things, but I'm a little reluctant to destroy them. However, I can't go against the orders of the main body, so I can only ask fellow Taoists to stop me. Zhang Yan nodded slightly and said, "How should I address you, sir?" When the young Taoist heard him ask this, he became slightly spirited and said, "I've given my family a name in this world, Jing Bai." Zhang Yan said, "I see that sir is like a free and unfettered person who can't bear to see the mortal world destroyed. Since you were sent here by the spirit of creation, you should also be emotionless and emotionless, so why did you have such thoughts?" Jing Bai sighed and said, "It's all thanks to fellow Taoist. You didn't completely eliminate the Tao techniques of my generation, but left behind a trace, so I was able to peek into the myriad of things in this world and have a mind of my own." Zhang Yan understood. This was another incarnation that was unwilling to submit to the main body. Listening to his words, it should be to avoid his senses, so it turned into qi and hid here to wait for an opportunity. However, after lying dormant for a long time, because it didn't condense its qi and didn't condense its thoughts to guide it, it was tainted by the mortal world. Speaking of which, it was very interesting. These incarnations of the spirit of creation and the bodies that had reincarnated into this world, as long as they had self-awareness, they would all be anxious to get rid of the main body. From the people he had come into contact with, there were almost no exceptions. He said, "But you should also know that if that main body of yours comes into this world, you still won't be able to get rid of it." Jing Bai waved his hand and said, "There's wine for today, let's get drunk for today. When the main body returns, we can think about those things." When he said this, he couldn't help but feel a little strange. He looked at Zhang Yan and said, "What, fellow Taoist Xianyuan isn't going to get rid of me?" Zhang Yan said indifferently, "Now that the barrier of the robbery power is getting weaker and weaker, it won't be difficult for me to get rid of you. However, that main body of yours might send another incarnation here, and it might not be as immersed in the world as you are." Jing Bai laughed at himself and said, "I didn't think there would be such benefits. Since fellow Taoist is willing to let me go, I also know what's good for me. I'll do whatever fellow Taoist says." At this moment, a middle-aged man carrying a pole passed by on the road. Jing Bai wrinkled his nose and waved at him, saying, "Come, come, come, come over here." The middle-aged man hurriedly walked over and asked, "What orders does Master Taoist have?" Jing Bai said excitedly, "What's in your pole?" The middle-aged man lifted the cloth covering the top, and the fragrance became even stronger. Pieces of thick flatbread were stacked together, separated by an oilcloth in the middle. The skin was golden and crispy, and he said, "The flatbread I made myself, and there's not a speck of dirt on it. Does Master Taoist want some?" The young Taoist hooked his little finger and grabbed a piece in his hand. He took a bite and was instantly overjoyed. He threw over a few strings of copper coins and said, all right, I'll take them all." He waved the flatbread at Zhang Yan and said, "Fellow Taoist, do you want some?" Zhang Yan smiled and said, "You can use it yourself, master." Jing Bai slapped his head and said, "I forgot. How could the grand supreme virtue care about the things of the world?" Zhang Yan smiled faintly and did not comment. The middle-aged man could not see Zhang Yan and only saw Jing Bai talking to himself. He found it a little strange and thought that this was probably a crazy Taoist. However, as long as he paid, he was not afraid. So he gathered his courage and asked, "Master Taoist, I still have a small pot of good wine that I brewed myself, and half a roasted chicken. Does Master Taoist want them?" Jing Bai's eyes lit up and he said, Yes, I want them all, I want them all." He threw over a few strings of coins and took a few gulps of wine. He sighed in satisfaction and said, "Let me ask you, how could I bear to destroy a mortal world like this?" At this moment, Zhang Yan said, "Since Master Taoist likes the mortal world, then you can stay here." As he spoke, he raised his sleeve and pointed a finger at Jing Bai. The latter felt his qi activity stiffen. If it was said that he could casually destroy this mortal world before, then he was now just like an ordinary cultivator. Although he could fly in the sky, tunnel into the earth, and move mountains, it would be difficult for him to leave this world. He shook his head and said, "This is also good, this is also good. I can taste the taste of the mortal world even more." Zhang Yan withdrew his hand. This person had his Wei suppression on him, so there was no need to fear any more strange movements. So with a thought, his figure disappeared. Jing Bai breathed a sigh of relief when he saw Zhang Yan leave. He muttered to himself, "What a pity! Even if all the venerable Vedantas join forces, they won't be able to stop my true body from descending. The delicacy of the mortal world before it shatters is even more worth a taste." As he spoke, he fiercely took a bite of the flatbread and swallowed it in 2 or 3 bites. Chapter 2297. In an instant, Zhang Yan's consciousness returned to his original body. With the clone of the spirit of creation staying there, before it was eliminated, the original body would not make any moves. Even if it insisted on sending out its clone, as long as the previous flaws were still there, and it was discovered in time, it would not pose too much of a threat. After this matter was settled for the time being, his thoughts returned to the original matter. It was not that there was no chance for him to make the general situation tilt towards his side. There was still a possibility of success. It should be known that not all Vedanta had the same opinion. In the past, the so-called general situation was only the general situation because there was no other choice, so it had to be so. But now, there was another choice for him. If he could communicate with these Vedanta, then even if only one of them stood on his side, the possibility of him achieving his goal would greatly increase. In the past, it might not be possible. But now that the tribulation power had been broken, even the Lord of the prison realm could make the Wei fall to communicate with him. In that case, he could also think of a way to transmit his will over. Thinking of this, he first thought of the person who was suspected to be the Shaoqing Grand Master's clone. Although this clone was incomplete due to the Wei and did not reach the level of Vedanta, he could only vaguely sense where it was hiding. He could not be sure of the specifics. This should be a unique method. Even the previous conflict between the spirit of creation and the Wei was avoided by it. If he were to communicate with it now, he might be able to discuss this matter. Having made up his mind, he immediately took out the qi activity that person had entrusted to him and called out in his heart. After a while, a sword light flashed and a Taoist appeared. Zhang Yan bowed and said, "Taoist, long time no see." The Taoist returned the greeting and said, "Taoist friend, you're too courteous. With your current abilities, there must be something important for you to call for me." Zhang Yan nodded and said, "I do have a matter that I would like to ask of you. After the essence of creation was broken, the Vedanta and the spirit of creation have been fighting against each other. Right now, it is about to reach the end. Previously, someone came to advise me to wait and wait until the power of calamity is broken. He even said that if I don't do so, it will cause the overall situation to collapse. However, when I wanted to ask for the inside story, he was secretive and refused to say it, only saying that we will know when the time comes." The Taoist didn't seem to care. He waved his sleeves and said, "The way we do things is to be free and unrestrained. Whatever we want to do, we can do it. There's no need to care about what others say. This fellow is sneaky and refuses to tell us the details. Why should we care about him?" Zhang Yan smiled and said, "I thought that what he said was the general situation, not my general situation. I have fought together with you, and we have a good understanding of each other, so I was thinking that after the spirit of creation breaks the power of calamity, would you be willing to join forces with me?" The Taoist looked at the crack and said, "I can give it a try." Zhang Yan said, "Then I'll leave it to you." The Taoist said, "You're too kind. According to what you said, this person is overcautious and hesitant. I don't want to have anything to do with such a person." He raised his hand and bowed again, then turned and walked into the depths of the void, disappearing in a flash. Zhang Yan thought for a while. The thoughts of the incarnation and the original body were different. He didn't know what choice this person would make in the end, and because of the obstruction of the calamity, the other party might not respond. But it was enough for him to say it in advance. And he wouldn't put all his hopes on one person. Next, it's time to find another person. Thinking of this, he changed his mind, and in an instant, an incarnation walked out of Shenyuan heaven. In Bu Su heaven, Luan Fang and Bing Kong were sitting in their own residence. Recently, They also felt that many things were not right, and the atmosphere in the void had become unusually tense. But they also understood that as long as it involved the battle between the Vedanta and the spirit of creation, ordinary spirit refinement cultivators almost had no room to intervene. Ever since they achieved the Tao, this kind of feeling of not being in control was very rare. Bing Kong's face was solemn. I see that the calamity power is already full of loopholes. The spirit of creation will arrive soon. Luan Fang said, Bu Su Heaven is the place in the void where the essence of creation is the most concentrated. As long as we hide here, I think even if there is a collapse, it won't affect this place. Bing Kong said in a deep voice, that's the reason, but the spirit of creation can be so powerful that we can't estimate it. If it weren't for the protection of fellow Taoist Xianyuan, even if we were in Bu Su Heaven, we wouldn't be able to resist the invasion of the spirit of creation's Weili. And if the battle becomes more intense, I'm afraid that fellow Taoist Xianyuan won't be able to take care of us. Luan Fang shook his head and sighed. He understood in his heart that he couldn't rely on others for this kind of thing. It was already good enough that they could hide in Bu Su Heaven. Even if they couldn't be protected, it was only their own luck and they couldn't blame others. Just as the two of them were talking, a young Taoist in a black robe walked out from the void. He walked over slowly and bowed. Greetings, fellow Taoists. Luan Fang and Bing Kong's hearts tightened. They didn't expect that the young Taoist would arrive just now when they were talking about Zhang Yan. They quickly stood up and bowed. Greetings, fellow Taoist. What brings you here? Zhang Yan said, I have something to ask the two of you. Luan Fang said, I see. He turned to the side and made a gesture of invitation. Please forgive me for not knowing that fellow Taoist would be here. Please take a seat. Zhang Yan nodded, waved his sleeves, and sat down on the guest seat. Luan Fang and Bing Kong followed suit and sat down. Then, they asked, May I know what fellow Taoist Xianyuan wants to know? Zhang Yan looked at the two and said, The two of you have fought against Ancestor Yao Han in the past. May I know when this started? Luan Fang pondered for a moment, then answered cautiously, To be honest, fellow Taoist, it happened before the essence of good fortune shattered. Due to our memory loss, we can't remember the details. After the essence of good fortune shattered, we fought against Ancestor Yao Han's Tao. That's how we managed to complete our Tao until fellow Taoist came. It wasn't hard for Bing Kong to understand that Zhang Yan was trying to find some clues about Ancestor Yao Han, so he said, Actually, Yu Lu and Yu Qiu are more familiar with Taoist Yao Han than we are. It's a pity that he's no longer here. Zhang Yan shook his head. Although Yu Lu and Yu Qiu were banished into eternal silence by him, there should still be traces of their Weili. However, he didn't find any traces of Ancestor Yao Han's Weili. Therefore, he suspected that the two of them came from the same source as Ancestor Yao Han. The reason why there were three of them was just to fool others. He pondered for a moment, then said, If that's the case, I'll need to borrow your qi to investigate some matters. From their conversation, it wasn't hard to tell that after the essence of good fortune shattered, the two of them had been fighting against Ancestor Yao Han and the other two for a long time. The conflict between Tao and Tao of virtue had spread across many realms. It could be said that they were the ones who had the most contact with Ancestor Yao Han's Weili. If he could borrow their qi and find the Weili left behind by Ancestor Yao Han, then he could pass on the message. Ancestor Yao Han was a person of great virtue. Although he might not care about the matter of his clone, he wouldn't be so naive as to think that the two of them would stand on his side. However, if he didn't try, who knew what the result would be? Luan Fang and Bing Kong looked at each other, but they didn't hesitate. They each took out a strand of qi and gave it to him. Zhang Yan took it, then his figure flickered and returned to his real body. He then used the qi to perform a divination. At this time, his incarnation in the mountain and sea realm's green heavenly temple arrived in front of the abyss and sent a message to the netherworld spring sect. Yuan Hongyang's clone was sitting in the sect. When he sensed his arrival, he came out to greet him. Esteemed one, what brings you here? Zhang Yan said, I have something to discuss with the patriarch of your sect, so I would like to ask fellow Taoists to set up an altar and offer a sacrifice. Yuan Hongyang thought for a moment, then said, I can give it a try. Esteemed one, please follow me. Zhang Yan nodded and followed him. In the next moment, they arrived in front of the Netherworld Spring Sex Patriarch Hall. Yuan Hongyang apologized and asked Zhang Yan to wait for a moment before entering the hall to pay his respects. Zhang Yan said, Sect leader Yuan, please go ahead. Yuan Hongyang cupped his hands and entered the hall. When he came out, he said, I've set up an altar in front of me. However, with my cultivation, I don't know if the patriarch will respond. Esteemed one, please come in and take a look. Zhang Yan nodded and said, Many thanks, sect leader Yuan. He flicked his sleeve and walked into the hall, and then he raised his head to look at the sacrificial altar before his expression changed slightly. In his eyes, there was a Taoist standing there at this moment. However, the figure was completely formed from strands of dim yellow threads of qi, causing it to seem like a portrait drawn by smoke, mysterious, unfathomable, and indistinct. He cupped his hands and said, Greetings, fellow Taoist. The silhouette returned the greeting. He didn't speak, but wisps of smoke floated over and condensed into words between the two of them. The words said, Fellow Taoist, do you have something to say to me? Zhang Yan didn't beat around the bush and directly stated his purpose. The Taoist stood for a moment as if he was considering his suggestion. However, he didn't make any response. He just cupped his hands and slowly left. Zhang Yan didn't mind. He didn't need any promises from the other party. It was fine as long as the other party knew what he wanted. He came out of the hall and thanked Yuan Hongyang. Then, his consciousness returned to the main body. At this moment, his expression became solemn. Now, only the great underworld patriarch hadn't been notified, so he had to return to Qinsong. If he could successfully pass on the message, then the patriarchs of the 9 continents and the 4 sects would have delivered the message. In fact, even if this didn't work out, it didn't matter too much. Based on the fact that he could visualize the spirit of creation and allow it to enter the Zhu Yi realm in advance, the great virtuous ones wouldn't be able to completely ignore him. They would definitely come to communicate with him again. At that time, there would be another opportunity. Mu/Ken, when/Shui if you think it's good, press Ctrl+D to bookmark this book. Chapter 2298. Mountain and Sea Realm, Dragon Abyss Sea. In the middle of the lake, a few small dragon carps were tossing and turning, chasing each other and kicking up waves. The young flood dragons couldn't bear the disturbance, and flew up into the sky on clouds. Guan Yingyue stood in a bronze pavilion high above the lake, occasionally sprinkling some medicinal pills, which caused the dragon carps to fight over them. The lake water was thrown into chaos. Next to him stood a mature and steady young man, who looked like a young adult. After observing for a long time, he said, Master, it seems the medicinal pills I sprinkled aren't enough for the dragon carps. Guan Yingyue said, That's right. The young man asked curiously, Master, why are you doing this? Guan Yingyue said, Because this is the only way to attract competition. He pointed down. If the lake water doesn't move, it's nothing more than a pool of stagnant water. If the dragon carps don't fight, they'll grow fat and greedy, and when that happens, they won't be of any use. The young man seemed to understand something. At this moment, a young cultivator came forward. He bowed and said, Teacher. Then he bowed to the young man and said, Senior martial brother. The young man hurriedly bowed back. Guan Yingyue didn't even turn his head. What is it? The young cultivator lowered his head. Master, he said, the spirit qi of the outer realm is getting weaker, and there are quite a few sects that have come to ask for our help. Should we still refuse them? Guan Yingyue stopped what he was doing and handed the medicinal pills back to the young man. He ordered him to continue feeding the dragon carps. Then he turned and said, Ever since the sects of the mountain and sea realm have interacted with the heavens and the myriad realms, which one of them has nothing to do with us? We can't open this door. Otherwise, if everyone comes begging, are we just going to let them into the realm? Let's stick to what we did before. Say that the mountain and sea realm won't let outsiders in. However, if there's anything they need, we'll help them out on account of our relationship as fellow Taoists. The young cultivator seemed to want to say something, but in the end he didn't. He just said, "As for the Shaoqing sect." Guan Yingyue shook his head and said, "You don't have to care about fellow Taoist Shaoqing's matter. If the outsiders can really pass their test, what's wrong with allowing them to enter?" In the mountain and sea realm, the Qinsong, the Shaoqing, and the Netherspring sects were in charge. Up until now, neither the Qinsong nor the Netherspring sects had opened an entrance. The Shaoqing sect's rules were simple: as long as you could defeat them in direct combat, they would let you in. However, up until now, no one had been able to do so. The young cultivator expressed his understanding and was about to withdraw when Guan Yingyue called him back, looked at him a few times, and said, "You seem to have something on your mind?" The young cultivator was silent for a moment before saying, "I have something to say, but I don't know if I should say it." Guan Yingyue glanced at him and said, "Since you have something to say, then say it. There is no need to be so secretive between master and disciple." "Disciple is being unreasonable," the young cultivator said. "There's something I've always wanted to say." His voice was a bit louder towards the end, causing the young man who was feeding to look over. The mountain and sea realm is filled with boundless spiritual qi. Those who have nothing to do with us are one thing. But if we don't allow those of our own generation to enter, why don't we give them some external medicine? It's not like the Qinsong school can't handle it. With that, the young cultivator lowered his head and continued, "Disciple might have been a bit rash when it comes to the sect's general strategy, but the mountain and sea realm. Netizen, please note, when reading for a long time, please pay attention to resting your eyes. This is a beautiful dividing line. If we sit back and watch our fellow Taoists fall into danger and do nothing to help them, how will others view us in the future? The reputation of the mountain and sea realm will be tarnished because of this." Guan Yingyue's voice was a bit flat as he said, "We are Taoists, so we don't need to care too much about such things. Nowadays, those who have spiritual qi to enjoy are defending their foundations, not just us. Those who don't have spiritual qi to use are fighting and killing each other. When the sect disappears and their lifespans run out, everything will disappear. How they view us is meaningless to me." The disciple couldn't help but argue, "But I don't think that's necessarily the case. The spiritual qi of the myriad heavens and realms has been in turmoil for thousands of years. Even the myriad heavens, which have stood for millions of years, are now beginning to collapse. Only the Qinghua heavens are still standing, but it's hard to say when they will fall to such a state." Guan Yingyue looked at him and said, "I didn't expect you to have such thoughts. No wonder you pity those sections. But you have to see that even though the myriad heavens are no longer in place, the Green Jade Palace is still protecting the Qinghua heavens. With Yuan Zun in charge, this realm can be said to be eternal and indestructible. When spiritual qi is revived, in another 1,000,000 years, won't it still be able to establish the current situation? And my Qinsong school has that person, so we don't need to fear such changes. So you don't need to worry." The disciple was still not convinced and argued, "But Master, we rely on the upper realm Almighty, but what's the point of us facing them? What if the Almighty changes it with a single thought?" Guan Yingyue shook his head and said, "You think too much. This is not something you should worry about. How can you guess the thoughts of those Almighty? You should be working hard to improve your cultivation like your fellow disciples, instead of worrying about these insignificant things." The disciple sighed and said, "Master, I understand the logic, but I just can't get around it." Guan Yingyue said, "In a few days, it will be the banquet of all sects. Go on my behalf and enjoy yourself there. Don't come back for a year." The young cultivator was stunned, thinking that his master did not like him, so he sent him away. He felt a little depressed, bowed, and said, "Yes, Master." Guan Yingyue watched him leave and couldn't help but laugh. He had seen people with similar thoughts as this disciple before. After this person understood the grandeur of the heavens and myriad worlds, and the mighty power of the upper realm, he always felt that he was small and insignificant, and thus began to doubt himself. However, after a few days of freedom, he would naturally cast aside these things that had nothing to do with him. He turned around and looked at the young man and said, "Disciple, what do you think?" The young man thought for a while and said, Senior apprentice brother, you seem to have a point. But from what I see, isn't the spiritual chi in the world the pills in our hands? And we are like the dragon carp, maybe the Almighty of the upper realm wants us to compete with each other for it. Guan Yingyue said, you have some understanding by analogy, but you need to remember, the thoughts of the Almighty of the upper realm is not something we can understand. You can think about it when you get close to that realm. Now, you just need to do what is in front of you. The young man seemed to understand, but he did not. As the two were talking, a talisman suddenly flew over from afar. Guan Yingyue caught it and looked at it. His expression turned serious. He looked at his disciple, thought for a while, and said, "Come with me." He waved his sleeve, and in an instant, the two of them arrived in front of the ancestral hall. At that moment, a Taoist in a black robe was standing there with his back facing them. Guan Yingyue took a deep breath and bowed, and said, "Greetings, Hall Master Guanzhen." The young man followed his master and bowed. Zhang Yan did not turn back. He stood on the jade steps and looked at the majestic hall door with his hands behind his back and said, "I am from, this is a beautiful dividing line, novel netizens please note, please rest your eyes when reading for a long time. This is a beautiful dividing line, go pay your respects to the ancestral master, Elder Guan can wait outside first." As the hall master, if he wanted to pay his respects to the ancestral master, he did not need anyone's permission. However, the ancestral hall was guarded by Guan Yingyue now, and he had to follow the sect's rules in Qinsong school, so he greeted him. Guan Yingyue hurriedly said, "I dare not, Hall Master Duzhen can do as you please." As he spoke, he saw Zhang Yan's robe fluttering, and he had already stepped into the ancestral hall. His figure quickly disappeared. The young man looked up at his master and tugged the latter's sleeve. There was excitement on his face, and he said, Master, is Hall Master Duzhen the one in the sect's rumors?" Guan Yingyue said, "Yes, he is." The young man exclaimed in a low voice, and he asked curiously, "Then, Master, is Hall Master Duzhen here to pay his respects to the ancestral master?" Guan Yingyue looked at the door of the hall and said with some emotion, "Just now, I've told you that the thoughts of the mighty people in the upper state are not something we can guess. You and I don't need to think too much about it, and just focus on our own cultivation." Somewhere in the sky of Buxu heaven, Azure Saint sat cross-legged with his eyes closed, and his spirit was floating in the void. He was the only one among the spirit refinement cultivators who dared to spread his own consciousness out of Buxu heaven, and this was to seek the best opportunity. No matter how difficult it was to seek Tao, as long as no one stopped him, he would never stop pursuing Tao. It was just that the Dada Weili were too strong, and his Weili would collapse as soon as he went up, so he could only look for the Dada Chi that might have been banished into eternal silence. Just as he was wandering around, he suddenly came into contact with a strange aura. This Chi was extremely mysterious, and it was clearly at the same level as the Dada. However, this time, it did not disperse his Weili, and instead, it took the initiative to find him. He was instantly alerted, and he immediately retreated to Buxu heaven. However, before he could do that, the other party had already shone into his spirit. In a trance, he saw a blurry figure there, and he asked coldly, "Who are you?" The blurry figure said, "Since you are looking for the best technique, why are you so resistant?" Azure Saint said in a deep voice, "Who are you? I don't talk to people of unknown origin." The figure smiled, "You have been wandering in the void for a long time. Even if I don't say it, you should be able to guess my identity." Azure Saint's expression turned cold, and he vaguely guessed the other party's identity. He asked cautiously, "What do you want?" The figure said, "I can feel that you are Weili in the void. What you are looking for is the best technique in the upper state, so why don't we make a deal?" Azure Saint asked in a deep voice, "What kind of deal?" The figure said, "My real body will soon return to everything, but Buxu heaven is still perfect, and it will take me a lot of effort to occupy this place. I don't need you to do anything, just accept the spirit that I send over at the crucial moment. As long as you agree, I will teach you the Tao technique, and I will even protect you after the battle. Are you willing?" Chapter 2299. As soon as the figure finished speaking, he transmitted a Tao technique to Qin Sheng. Qin Sheng wanted to reject it, but when he saw the countless techniques flowing into the divine decree, he could not help but accept it. The figure seemed to have expected this and teased, "Fellow Taoist, you can cultivate it with ease. I developed this technique based on your own cultivation technique, and it is not the same as mine. No matter how high one's cultivation is, as long as you don't take the initiative to talk about it, no one will be able to tell." Qin Sheng scoffed, "But based on what I know, if I want to improve my cultivation, only the cultivation technique is useless. Unless I have the help of creation Pauline, it will be hard to achieve." The figure said meaningfully, "Creation Pauline, even if I find it now, do you dare to use it? But don't worry, if your cultivation is really there, I will find one for you." Qin Sheng asked, "How can I trust you?" The figure said, "That's easy. You can cultivate the Tao technique first. If I don't find creation Pauline, you don't have to do anything. What's the loss for you?" Taoist Azure Saint understood that it was not so easy to take advantage of the other party. If he first cultivated this Tao art, then in reality, he had already joined the other party's formation. In that case, if he refused to follow the other party's instructions as long as the other party leaked this matter to Zhang Yan, it would be hard to say how the latter would treat him. If it was him, he would definitely not tolerate it. Even though he knew this, he did not say anything. The figure saw that he did not say a word and knew that he had agreed to it. He laughed, "Fellow Taoist, when the time is right, I will come and find you." Qin Sheng said, "Hold on." The figure said, "Is there anything else?" Qin Sheng said slowly, "If I were to cultivate this technique, where would I find you?" The figure said, "As long as you, Weili, are still outside of Busu heaven, if you cultivate this technique, once I sense it, I will come and find you. I just have to remind you that my real body will be here soon. You have to make up your mind as soon as possible. If you miss this chance, you won't have another chance." Qin Sheng was silent for a while and said, "I understand." The figure did not stay any longer and retreated from his divine will. Azure Saint checked himself carefully and confirmed that there was nothing wrong with his body. Although the possibility of the other party tampering with his body was very low, he was still cautious. He thought about it for a moment. Even if he told Zhang Yan about this, the spirit of creation probably wouldn't care. After all, no matter what the result was, there wouldn't be any loss to him. He repeatedly pondered, and after a long time, he finally made a decision. He would head for Xinyuan heaven. Zhang Yan stepped into the hall of the patriarchs and walked along the long path. Because this was a restricted area, only the hall masters of the 3 halls and the guards in name could enter. Servants and Taoist children were not qualified to enter, and even the formation spirits did not exist. Therefore, there was no one here, only the sound of water flowing on both sides of the path. After walking for a long time, he arrived in front of the Hall of Offerings. The jade medallion of the master of the Duzhen Hall flew out from his body, emitting a beam of light that shone on the closed golden stone door in front of him. The door silently moved to either side. He swept his gaze around. He had been here several times before, but it still looked the same. It could be said that this place had not changed since the second-generation patriarch had set it up. He stepped into the inner room and came to the main hall. He looked up and saw that on the jade altar, the memorial tablet of the Tai Ming patriarch was placed at the top, followed by the past sect masters, and on the left and right were the memorial tablets of the past Duzhen Hall and Rikong Hall master. These 2 memorial tablets had been removed before the 5th-generation sect master, Qin Qinggang, ascended. Later, after the Qinsong school had established itself in the mountain and sea realm, Qin Mabai had moved them back. Zhang Yan knew that the reason why the 5th-generation sect master Qin Qinggang did this, including not appointing the next sect master as his successor, was because he had his reasons. Before he had ascended, the Qinsong school had actually had some sort of connection with the Void Muddy realm. At the time, there were rumors that a piece of origin jade had landed in the Void Muddy realm where the Qinsong school resided. The sect master had tried to use the name of the patriarch to pressure the Qinsong school. In order to prevent such a thing from happening, Qin Qinggang had received the orders of Patriarch Qin, Yuan Zhongzi, and the other previous sect masters. He had deliberately not appointed a sect master and had removed the memorial tablets of the 2 hall masters. Without leaving a word, he had ascended, completely severing his connection with the void muddy realm. Zhang Yan didn't comment on whether what he had done was right or wrong. However, the results showed that under the leadership of Sect Master Qin, the Qinsong school had walked a different path and had even reached its current state. He looked at the offering table and took a step forward, preparing to pay his respects to the founding master. However, just as he was about to do so, the precious light and names on the memorial tablets of all the previous sect leaders disappeared, becoming blank. Only the 4th sect leader's memorial tablet did not change. As the Grand Vedanta, he acknowledged the status of the previous sect masters, but those sect masters didn't dare to let him worship them. However, only the 4th sect master hadn't reached the Tao, so he naturally didn't feel it. However, the Vedanta had a part of the great Tao in his hand, and under the response of the heavenly secrets, he naturally turned into the same appearance. He didn't care about this. He walked to the table, bowed slightly, and bowed to the Patriarch's tablet. At this moment, the scenery around him changed. Everything turned into nothingness and gradually faded away. It was as if he was standing in the void again. Moreover, apart from his own power, there was another type of boundless power that existed here, one that flowed without end and without end. He had come into contact with the Tai Ming Patriarch's aura many times, and he knew that this was the Patriarch's Weili. However, at this moment, only the Weili was here, and he didn't see the figure of the Patriarch. He thought for a while, and tried to put his thoughts into it, but he didn't get any response. After doing so, the surrounding scenery turned from nothingness to reality, and he found himself back in the Patriarch Hall again. He recalled the scene just now, and his heart moved slightly. He seemed to have thought of something, and then he nodded, bowed to the offering table again, and left the hall. In fact, this time, he could still look for the owner of the Devil Treasury, but after careful consideration, he gave up on this idea. Judging from the actions of the 4 major sects patriarchs who went to the 9 continents to establish sects, these 4 were likely to be in the same camp. Even if there were differences, it wouldn't be a big deal. As for the competition between the sects, it actually didn't mean anything. It was just a competition between disciples, and without the contradiction of spiritual opportunity, they might not even fight to the death. To the Vedanta, it was even more of a trivial matter. The owner of the Devil Treasury and the Lord of the Prison Realm were different. Both of them didn't establish their own sects, and instead, they established their own structure. Just by looking at the behavior of both parties, one could already see the difference between them. Therefore, he boldly guessed that the owner of the Devil Treasury and the Lord of the Prison Realm might be closer, and thus decided to ignore them. He raised his head and looked at the crack. Although he didn't communicate directly with the Patriarch, he had already made his intentions clear. He had already made his move, and now it was time to see how the other party would deal with it. He changed his mind and returned to the Qinghuan Palace. Just now, he sat down, and his heart suddenly felt something. He summoned the array spirit and ordered it to welcome the guest at the door. At the same time, Qing Sheng arrived at the Xianyuan Heavenly Palace. A Taoist boy came out and greeted him. Tai Shang, the master knows that you're here, and he ordered me to welcome you in. Qing Sheng nodded and followed the Taoist boy into the inner room. Soon he saw Zhang Yan. After greeting him, he said, "Just now, I have something to report to you." Zhang Yan saw his serious expression, and he had already guessed what it was. He nodded and said, "Please speak." Qing Sheng then told him about his encounter with the spirit of creation, as well as his conversation with it. He had thought it through. The reason why the spirit of creation looked for him was that he was a person who really wanted something from within. He had always prioritized benefits, and as long as it was beneficial to him, he would do it. However, benefits and benefits were different. Only by ensuring his own existence could he seek for more things. In Bushtian, he didn't think that he could hide from Zhang Yan. Even if he became a Vedanta, so what? If Zhang Yan really wanted to deal with him, how could the spirit of creation protect him? Don't be fooled by the spirit of creation's nonchalance on the surface. saying that it was just to reduce some trouble. If he could easily deal with Zhang Yan, why would he need to do such a thing in the dark? Zhang Yan listened and smiled. I see. Since the spirit of creation took the initiative to give the Tao to you, you can't miss out on his kindness. You can take it and cultivate. If you succeed and he wants to entrust Pauline to you, you can accept it. Qing Sheng was stunned, but he immediately understood. He bowed and said, As you wish, Taoist. Now that Zhang Yan had given him an explanation, he was at ease. Moreover, he could openly practice his cultivation method. After saying a few more words of thanks, he bade farewell and left. Zhang Yan was deep in thought. He had guessed that the spirit of creation would definitely do something after the clone had been silent for a long time. This time, the spirit of creation's breakthrough point was with Qing Sheng. It seemed that he wanted to break through Bushtian. The reason why he didn't stop this was because it was very likely that the spirit of creation would really take out the last treasure lotus of fortune in order to achieve its goal. Although it might not be the complete Pauline, if he could intercept a wisp of Qi dynamic, then the Tao of strength could be completed. He was collecting Pauline's Qi dynamic everywhere. The spirit of creation might know, but it might not know what he really wanted to do. It was impossible for the owner of the Devil Treasury to spread the news that he was trying to open up a Tao technique of strength, so the spirit of creation could only guess that he was trying to find a backup plan, just in case everything was destroyed and he could open it up again. However, this was not part of his plan, so he didn't have too much hope. He still calmed down and continued to search for the Tao of creation. After some time, he felt something. He looked up and felt the robbery power move slightly. Then, a familiar Whaley came to the Tao of creation and fell towards Bushtian. He smiled. It seemed that his will had been successfully passed on, so this person had no choice but to communicate with him again. Chapter 2300. Zhang Yan let go of Bu Su Tian's door and allowed the strand of Whaley to enter. Previously, he knew that even if he did not try to communicate with the four patriarchs, he could summon the creation spirit into the all-being at any time, and the other party would not be able to bypass him. Although he might not have done so. However, as long as this ability existed, it was enough to make the great virtues feel restraining fear and unable to ignore him. If he did not send a message to the four patriarchs, the other party would not have appeared in such a timely manner, which in turn meant that his strategy was successful. Now, he could shake the so-called general trend of the prison realm lord from both inside and outside, forcing the other party to communicate with him again. However, at this time, he suddenly noticed that the Whaley was moving. It did not just fall into Bu Su Tian, but also into the all-being. He did not know where it went. He pondered for a moment and smiled, but he didn't think too much about it. With a thought, an avatar walked out of his body and stepped into the celestial sphere walk. In a flash, it entered the celestial sphere. The Taoist was already waiting here. Seeing Zhang Yan, he bowed and said, I didn't want to come this time. Zhang Yan smiled and said, Actually, you didn't have to come. The Taoist said, If I can pass through the power of calamity, so can the spirit of creation. I have my plans and arrangements, and the spirit of creation also has his plans and arrangements. There can't be too many mistakes here, and every time fellow Taoist makes a move, the variables will increase. For the sake of the big picture, I have no choice but to come. Zhang Yan smiled faintly and did not say anything. He only waited for the other party to continue. The Taoist said, Now that things have come to this, I can let you know everything. I can also let you be like the other Taoists and be a successor. I only hope that you can give up what you've been doing and join the general trend. Zhang Yan nodded and said, Indeed, I should be included in the general trend, but why isn't everyone included in my general trend, but I am included in everyone's general trend? The Taoist said in a deep voice, Since the moment the spirit of creation was born, we've been fighting against it. This general trend was deduced through the joint efforts of all the fellow Taoists. Now, it's already at the final step. Fellow Taoist, you've only achieved it after the spirit of creation shattered, so your knowledge of the spirit of creation is limited. How can you be the master of the general trend? Zhang Yan shook his head and said, But with your power, can you really calculate all the variables? If it was really possible, how could it have caused the void to crack so many times? The Taoist said, "Fellow Taoist, do you know that you are not part of our scheme?" Zhang Yan said with a faint smile, "If everything is within the general trend that you speak of, then why do you need to come here to fill in the loopholes? Not to mention anything else, he himself could also be considered a variable. If the other party could really calculate all this, there wouldn't be this conversation today." At the end of the day, after being trapped by the tribulation power, all the operation of the great Tao was no longer under his control. Moreover, just as he had guessed, not all the great virtue here had the same opinion. It was very likely that it was only the insistence of the Lord of the Prison Realms faction. Otherwise, the so-called general trend wouldn't have been unstable the moment he transmitted his thoughts. The Taoist fell silent for a moment and said, "I originally came here to put an end to the dispute. After all, fellow Taoist and I are all cultivators. Since fellow Taoist insists on his own opinion, then I won't persuade you anymore. When the final battle comes, we'll know who is more important. There's one more thing. Because of the spirit of creation, I still can't tell you what you need to know. However, the answer here is within the tribulation power. If fellow Taoist wants to know, you can go and take it. At that time, everything will be clear." Zhang Yan raised his eyebrows and said, "Within the tribulation power?" At the same time, in the great world domain created by Xiangju and the others, a wisp of Wei suddenly landed here. It turned into a figure and appeared in front of everyone. Xiangju stood up and said, "Fellow Taoist, where did you come from?" Everyone also looked over. On the surface, the person who came should be the incarnation of a great virtue. Just now, there was another Wei in the tribulation power. They also felt it. From the aura, it wasn't difficult to tell that the person who came was this person. The Taoist said, "My original body is still in the tribulation power. I just borrowed a gap. Just now, I sent a wisp of consciousness back to you all to bring a few words to you." Xiangju said, "What words?" The Taoist said, "Do you all know why your Wei is never complete?" When everyone heard this, their expressions became a little more subtle. Xiangju smiled and said, "Fellow Taoist, do you know why?" The Taoist said, "That's actually your own choice. When the creation spirit was broken, you all deliberately separated a wisp of your Wei to restrain it with us. It's so that after the tribulation power is broken, you all can occupy a place in the great Tao chessboard." When the people present heard this, they could vaguely sense something. Wei Ming frowned and said, "Can you explain it more clearly?" The Taoist shook his head and said, "There's no need for me to explain this. I'm just reminding you all. After the tribulation power is broken, you all will understand." At this point, his tone became a little more solemn and said, "What I want to tell you is that the creation spirit's original Wei is being restrained is because of your contributions. Therefore, when the tribulation power is broken, you all can make your own choice. You don't need to submit to anyone." Everyone came to a realization. The Taoist was obviously trying to persuade them not to follow Zhang Yan. Hengwu said, "You didn't come to warn us before, but now you're here. Is it because of Taoist Shenyuan?" The Taoist did not hide it and said, "It's because of him. His actions have already affected the overall situation. If the creation spirit wins against us because of this, none of you will be able to escape." He had come here to threaten Zhang Yan. That was why he was talking to Zhang Yan while trying to persuade the crowd. If Xiangju and the others no longer stood on Zhang Yan's side, then he would naturally be isolated. From his point of view, it was impossible for Zhang Yan to change the overall situation by himself. Then, his original plan would fall apart. In Kong said, "Now that the creation spirit's original body is about to break through the tribulation power, even we can't confirm if there's anything wrong with us. How can we believe what you said?" The Taoist said, "Everyone, you don't have to believe me now. Once the tribulation power is broken, you will know that what I said is true. It won't be too late for you to make your choice then. I hope everyone will be careful." Speaking up to here, he cupped his hands together and his figure vanished. Even the mighty force vanished without a trace along with him. Xiangju thought for a while and looked at everyone. What do you think? Ji Zhuang said in a deep voice, it's just a one-sided story. Hongdu sneered and said, I'll do what I want to do. Why do I need others to tell me what to do? Ing Kong said calmly, this person said that he fought against the creation spirit before, but he can't prove it. What he said is just a lie. Although the Taoist came to confuse Xiangju and the others, he missed one point, and that was that Zhang Yan had fought against the creation spirit. Whether it was in terms of strength or in terms of the camp they stood on, this was the most direct evidence and was worthy of their trust. Therefore, it was impossible to make Xiangju and the others waver on this matter of life and death with just a few words. Moreover, their Tao arts had all been seen by Zhang Yan. It could be said that they had placed all their hopes of resisting the spirit of creation on Zhang Yan. How could it be possible for them to suddenly change their stance now? In Xianyuan heaven, after the Taoist left, Zhang Yan stared at the cracked land. In fact, the meaning of the Taoist's words before he left was very clear. If you want to fight for the general trend, then you must have the ability to withstand the tribulation power. If you can't even pass the stage, then it's impossible for the Vedantas to choose you. This should not only be the Taoist's intention, but perhaps it was also what the ancestors wanted to pass on to him. Not long ago, the tribulation power began to disappear bit by bit, as if it was being devoured by something. The so-called tribulation power was actually the aftermath of the destruction of the creation spirit. Not only did it trap the creation spirit, but it also caused the Vedantas to break away from everything. Therefore, the Vedantas and the creation spirit were suppressing each other on one hand and resisting the tribulation power on the other. If they didn't do so, it was very likely that both sides would be forced into eternal silence. The three sides were entangled with each other, and no one had the upper hand. But as the Vedantas gradually returned, the tribulation power's blockade was also broken bit by bit. The tribulation power was the same as the Vedantas' Wali. It was also endless, so it couldn't be worn out. The reason why it seemed to be weakening now was that the power of the Vedantas and the creation spirit was gradually increasing. There was no doubt that although the confrontation between the two sides restrained each other, it also gradually pushed them to a higher level of the Great Tao. The tribulation power that could suppress both sides didn't grow, so it was gradually suppressed. This was a tribulation, a battle, and at the same time, an opportunity. At this moment, the battle was about to reach the time when the outcome was decided. Zhang Yan felt that since the tribulation energy could be seen by him, and it even appeared after the essence of creation was shattered, then it ought to be a part of the Tao art that was missing like the spirit of creation. However, no one was able to suppress it earlier, and there was an opponent involved, so they were naturally unable to obtain its profundities. But now that it was being suppressed, it was actually the other two sides that were digesting the biggest piece of the fruit. His eyes flashed slightly. If that was the case, then he couldn't miss this opportunity. Even though he might not be able to seize this part of the great Tao, he couldn't let the creation spirit occupy too much of it. Even if the other Vedantas obtained it, it was better than being taken by this fellow. And when the tribulation power was completely removed, it would be the time for the true battle. With that thought, he stood up and waved his sleeves. In an instant, the boundless Wali had already appeared in the sky, and then it crashed into the tribulation power. Chapter 2301. As soon as Zhang Yan's Wali charged into the tribulation power, he quickly sensed countless forces pressing against him. If he allowed this force to invade his body, then it was very likely that he would be driven into eternal silence. He only needed to use his mighty force, and with a light struggle, he was able to repel this force. However, in the next moment, this force was connected to his mighty force, and he couldn't get rid of it no matter what. He understood that once he was touched by the tribulation power, there was no way out. He had to fight it to the end, and if the tribulation power didn't drive him away, then he would have to suppress it. This was why the spirits of creation and the great benevolence were sealed. Aside from fighting each other, they had to constantly resist the tribulation power, and they were powerless to do anything else. However, he could sense that whether it was the spirits of creation or the great benevolence, None of them had any intention of fighting each other. They were all doing their best to suppress the tribulation power and wanted to peek at the Tao hidden behind it. As such, he did not do anything unnecessary and began to deduce the Tao contained within the tribulation power. However, he did not forget what the Taoist said. There was everything he needed to know here, so he was still splitting his attention to observe. Soon his eyes flickered. He saw that the tribulation power was slightly different from the tribulation power elsewhere, so he moved his divine sense closer. At this moment, due to the tribulation power being surrounded by three parties, it naturally caused quite a bit of change, causing all things to tremble violently. The tribulation power continued to exist after the essence of creation shattered, and it even caused all things to change. The most obvious change here was that the spirits of creation covered all things. It could be said that aside from the 9 continents, all the living beings of the human path in the world could be considered spirits of creation. Not only that, after the essence of creation shattered, countless lands of creation were created, forming the current situation of the void. And this situation was about to change again. However, this was also relatively speaking. For those worlds that did not attach themselves to the land of creation, even if they had experienced billions of years, from the beginning of the world to the end of the world, and magnified to the entire void, it would only be an instant before the world was destroyed. The living beings inside would not feel anything strange at all. Only the world that coexisted with the land of creation could sense the changes here. Just like that, inside and outside of Su Tian, anyone with profound cultivation could feel that there was a change that was related to them happening in the unseen world, but they did not know why. This was because the clash between the great virtue, creation spirits, and tribulation force was enough to shake everything. Now that Zhang Yan had joined in, it had already affected the fortune of the great Tao. Regardless of whether one was a powerful cultivator or a mortal, as long as one was still under the rules of the great Tao, there was no distinction between nobility and inferiority. One could only passively endure this. In fact, the order of the great Tao hadn't truly changed yet. If they waited until the change was complete, they wouldn't be able to feel anything. In the eyes of the world, the sky was above, the earth was below, the head was the top, and the feet were the bottom. This was common sense, and most people would not question it. However, if the order was changed, then perhaps everything would be reversed. But because they were born in the great Tao, they would not find it strange, and would only see it as a matter of course. Most of the lowly mortals worked hard to make a living. Even if they felt it, they would quickly get used to it. As long as it didn't involve themselves, they would not have the thought or the ability to change it. Those with high cultivation realms were able to sense this. The world that was originally familiar seemed to have an additional sense of unfamiliarity. Xiangju and the other great virtue could feel it more directly. They could see that Zhang Yan's mighty mana filled the void and directly invaded the tribulation force. Heng Wu's expression was solemn, and he said, "Fellow Taoist Xianyuan, are you planning to break into the tribulation force and directly fight with the creation spirits?" Xiangju's cultivation was slightly higher, and he sensed for a moment, and said with certainty, that shouldn't be the case. He's taking the initiative to disperse the tribulation force. Wei Ming was shocked and asked, "Why is fellow Taoist Xianyuan doing this?" Not only him, but the others were also confused. To them, under the premise that the missing Tao was not found, the longer the tribulation force lasted, the better it would be, so that there would be more time to prepare. Hong Do showed a look of disdain and said, "You all have no vision. The tribulation force is obviously about to disperse, and the creation spirits and the others are dividing the tribulation force to obtain the Tao behind it. Fellow Taoist Xianyuan, in order to prevent the creation spirits from obtaining the Tao, joined in. If we do as you all say and do nothing, and if the creation spirits win, then we will be letting them gain the upper hand for no reason." Hearing this, everyone came to a realization. It was not that they were not knowledgeable enough, they also knew that the great Tao behind the tribulation force was, but the tribulation force was too powerful. Not only did it block the creation spirits, it also suppressed the Weili. Usually, they would want to stay away from it, so why would they think about obtaining the Tao? Wei Ming pondered for a while and looked at the cracked land and said, "Now that the tribulation force is declining, if we take the tribulation force now, can we take a part of the Tao from it?" Hong Do sneered, "It's not that I look down on you all, but how can the tribulation force be so easily touched? With your mana, you would be driven into eternal silence if you touch it even a little. Even though the Whaley have recovered a little, but even the creation spirits have been trapped by the tribulation force for a long time. If you want to get a glimpse of the Tao, you must at least have the ability to fight against the creation spirits." Xiang Ju smiled and said, "Fellow Taoist Wei Ming only said that. Although we can't deal with the tribulation power on our own, it's not impossible if we work together. However, since fellow Taoist Xianyuan didn't tell me about this, we can just wait here. Otherwise, we might ruin the plan if we rush forward." In Cheong Shao Tian, Dan Yi's expression was unusually serious. He could feel that as the tribulation force was gradually weakened, the creation spirit's Whaley that was almost completely destroyed fell back into the world and became active again. Then, the Tao of the creation spirits began to spread across the heavens and realms again. Bu Su Tian, Mirror Lake, and other realms were still manageable. After all, there were true yang cultivators in these two places. In the places shrouded by their mana, they could change the cognition of living beings. Although this could only suppress them for a while, it was enough for now. However, the other realms could not be controlled, especially those that were attached to the land of creation. Even the major sects did not have any power to resist. If they did not find a way to stop them, they might become the creation spirit's Tao field. Just as he was about to take action, he felt something in his heart. He calculated and said, "So Taoist Xianyuan has arranged such a contingency plan. However, I'm afraid it's not enough with just these forces." He thought for a while and said, "Since we have the same goal, then I'll help them." As he thought about it, countless incarnations had fallen into many realms. In the Yen sect headquarters, Gao Qingtu had just received an order from the patriarch. This time, he had to fight against the creation spirits with all his strength and wipe out all the realms where the Whaley existed. He did not have to worry about the other sections. After he finished reading, he said solemnly without any hesitation, "Pass down my order. Summon the altar masters of all the realms to the main altar for a meeting." After issuing the order, he came to the discussion hall. Behind him was a towering Tao tablet that pierced through the clouds. In front of him was a neatly stacked psychic jade wall. It looked as tall as a mountain, like half a city wall. Since the Yen sect's various branches needed people to preside over, it was impossible for the altar masters to rush over in time. Moreover, this would delay the official business too much. Therefore, it was most convenient to reflect their figures into the psychic jade wall. Only an hour later, a spiritual light flashed on the psychic jade wall. The figure of the first altar master appeared and bowed to greet Gao Qingtu. Just a few breaths after this person appeared, flashing spots of light appeared one after another, and densely packed figures appeared. Soon, a dazzling silver light appeared on the city wall. Currently, the Yen sect occupied more than 90,000 realms. If every realm had an altar master, then there were at least 90,000 people. Because the situation of the realms was different, there were strong and weak altar masters. Some could assume the position at the core transformation realm, while some needed to be at the mortal transformation realm. But regardless of their status and cultivation, every one of them represented the forces of the realm behind them. At this moment, they were all gathered together. Gao Qingtu looked at the scene in front of him, and a sense of pride welled up in him. After all, the Yen sect was founded from scratch by him and his disciples. But when he thought of the official business, he quickly put away this emotion. He looked at the crowd and said in a deep voice, "The spirit of creation Tao law poisons living beings. It only worships Tao and not life. Everywhere this law goes, it obliterates human intelligence and nature. It treats humans like pigs, dogs, and horses, to be slaughtered and ravaged as blood and resources. My Yen sect shall eliminate such an evil law. Today, under the orders of the sect ancestor, we've summoned everyone here to exterminate this law together." Many altar masters listened with solemn expressions. Although they knew that this matter was difficult to handle, since it was the sect ancestor's orders, there was nothing to say. They just had to do as he said. Half a day later, the spiritual lights on the psychic jade walls dispersed. As the orders were passed down, the Yen sect of all realms mobilized. However, the Yen sect's actions made all the sects extremely nervous. Previously, the Yen sect tried its best to restrain itself from clashing with the sections. It even took the initiative to withdraw from the place with abundant spiritual opportunity. It seemed easy to talk to, but in reality, those who truly knew the power of the Yen sect would absolutely not dare to have such thoughts. It could be said that in the myriad heavens, as long as there was the existence of the human Tao, there would be traces of the Yen sect. In particular, there were realm gates that connected the realms. It could twist these forces into one place at any time, which was even more terrifying. Moreover, apart from the fact that the Yen sect didn't have a true young almighty expert to oversee it, it could practically suppress the majority of the sects in the world. Within the myriad heavens, there were very few opponents that could match it. Fortunately, the news that came later confirmed that the Yen sect was only dealing with the spirit of creation Tao law. Only then did the sects relax. However, they also restrained their forces one after another, trying their best to avoid angering the Yen sect at this time. You're tuning in to the Passion Pages YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support, and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.